Hey, before we settle into this long deep dive, let me say something soft and simple for the people watching from different places tonight. No matter what time it is where you're listening from, morning in the US, late night in the UK, afternoon in Canada, evening in Australia, I'm glad you're here. If you want more long sleepy history stories like this, feel free to tap like, maybe subscribe. If you enjoy slow storytelling, and drop a comment after. I always enjoy reading what country you're listening from. Feels like all of us are sitting in one calm room together. Alright, let's drift back in time. Let's step quietly into warm Bahamian air. And let's begin with something curious that once existed on the edge of the Caribbean world. A place so strange and so bold that governments feared it, merchants hated it, sailors admired it, and history still whispers about it. It was called the Republic of Pirates. And it lived, for a moment. But oh, what a moment it was. The first thing you need to picture is Nassau, early 1700s, long before the bright streets, hotels, and crowds. Back then it was a worn-out wooden settlement clinging to New Providence Island. The air smelled of salt, tar, rum, and wet ropes baking under the sun. Buildings leaned at tired angles, roofs patched with mismatched boards, windows covered with thin cloth for shade. Goats wandered between huts. Fishermen called from the docks. Sand blew everywhere. And yet, for a handful of years, this place became the unofficial capital of the most notorious pirate brotherhood ever gathered in one spot. They weren't a gang in the modern sense, more a loose alliance of captains and crews who understood that strength came from numbers. There were faces among them that ring through pirate history like cracked bells. Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, Mbani, Mary Read, Benjamin Hornigold, Sam Bellamy, and above all Edward Thatch, better known as Blackbeard. But before they ruled Nassau, before they shaped it into a pirate republic, the island went through a long slow collapse. It hadn't always been a pirate haven. At first it was an English settlement, meant to support trade routes and protect nearby shipping lanes. But constant attacks, hurricanes, and neglect hollowed it out. By the early 1700s, the government had practically abandoned it. No military, no strong governor, no stable trade. And into that vacuum drifted men who had nowhere else to go. Sailors tired of brutal navy discipline. Sailors cheated by merchant captains. Sailors who survived shipwrecks. Sailors who escaped impressment. And sailors who simply looked around at a world where the rich grew richer and the poor stayed hungry, and said quietly, "No, not anymore." Then came the War of the Spanish Succession. England armed thousands of sailors as privateers, legal pirates hired to attack enemy ships. But when the war ended in 1713, the Crown dismissed them with no pay, no support, and no plan. A whole generation of skilled, battle-hardened mariners suddenly found themselves broke, drifting, and burning with frustration. So, many of them chose the only path that kept them fed. They turned to piracy. And where did they gather? Where did they anchor their stolen sloops? Where did they bring their prizes, mend their hulls, share their loot, and rest their weather-beaten bones? The perfect place. Shallow waters that protected small pirate craft but threatened deep-hulled navy ships. Proximity to the shipping lanes of the Caribbean, access to markets for stolen goods, and almost no government oversight. When the pirates first arrived in force, Nassau was half destroyed from earlier attacks and storms. But that didn't matter. Pirates didn't need perfection. They needed safety. They needed somewhere the world couldn't easily touch them. And Nassau became exactly that. Imagine ships coming in at dawn with blackened sails and patched rigging, their crews calling out to friends waiting on shore. Men carrying barrels of rum from captured vessels. Others dragging crates of sugar or tobacco onto the sand. Laughter echoing between the half-collapsed buildings. Campfires burning bright at night. Fiddles, shouts, songs drifting through the warm air. But here's the thing that made Nassau different from any pirate base before it. They didn't just hide there. They shaped it, transformed it, organized it. They created a rough, improvised, chaotic, but strangely functional republic. A place where captains were elected, not crowned. where every crew member had a vote, where injured men received compensation, where stolen goods were divided fairly, where race mattered far less than skill. Black sailors and freedmen held power, fought, earned shares, and became respected crew members long before equality moved through the wider world. Where rules existed not because some king declared them, but because pirates themselves wrote them. It wasn't democracy as we know it now, but it was closer to it than almost anything in the 18th century. And this place, this fragile, sandy, noisy island, became the center of it all. The flying gang's networks stretched from the coasts of Carolina to the Yucatan, from Jamaican waters to Cuban shores. Their sloops darted across the sea like sharks. Merchant captains dreaded the sight of a small, fast ship riding low in the water. Her cannons run out, her crew armed with cutlasses and pistols. And as their fame spread, Nassau's population swelled. Some historians say up to 1,000 pirates lived there at the height of the Republic, a staggering number for the time. That many armed men, all gathered in one place, all living outside the reach of the crown. It frightened European powers. Yet on the island itself, life felt surprisingly free. Rough but free. Imagine walking the sandy paths between huts at twilight. Lanterns glowing like warm droplets of fire. Pirates sitting outside, fixing clothing, cleaning pistols, sharpening blades, playing dice. The smell of roasting fish drifting through the air. Voices from every corner of the Atlantic mixing. Irish, English, African, French, Dutch, indigenous Caribbean accents. A strange, living mosaic of people who came together not by birth, but by choice. And yet, beneath the laughter, the drinking, the music, something else lingered. Tension. Quiet knowledge. A faint ripple in the air. That the world beyond Nassau, the world of empires and navies and governments, had finally noticed what was happening on this small island, and was beginning to move toward it. Slowly, silently, but inevitably. The first real signs of change in Nassau didn't come with a cannon blast or a royal decree. They came with whispers. Soft ones. Drifting across taverns and between ships anchored in the harbor. Whispers that England, exhausted from war and embarrassed by its rising pirate problem, was finally preparing to act. But for a while, the whispers felt distant, like far-off thunder rumbling behind a blue sky. Life went on in its strange, chaotic rhythm. During these early years of the Pirate Republic, the flying gang was still shaping itself, still testing its strength and figuring out what they could get away with. They didn't plan to build a society. It just grew out of necessity. Sailors needed shelter. They needed rules. They needed a loose order so hundreds of armed, unpredictable men could live in the same tiny space without tearing each other apart. And somehow, they made it work. Nassau's main gathering place was a cluster of rough taverns near the waterline. None of them were proper buildings. Some were open-air shacks with driftwood counters, others patched together rooms with sand floors and leaky roofs. But they were loud, busy, alive. Pirates drank watered rum, argued over dice games, bragged about prizes taken at sea, and swapped stories with an energy that felt almost electric. You could hear conversations about everything, from politics to ghosts to shipwrecks. Some nights the talk rose like a storm, and other nights it softened into murmurs and laughter. No one cared about manners or class here. A poor sailor could speak to a captain without fear. A freed black crewman could sit beside an English-born helmsman, both with equal shares in the last captured ship. A woman like and bonny could walk into the tavern and be treated as fiercely and respectfully as any man carrying steel. It was messy, wild, imperfect. But it was also a glimpse of something rare in the early 18th century. Equality, even if only temporary. Many pirates had experienced the exact opposite before joining the flying gang. They'd served under brutal merchant officers who withheld wages, beat them for mistakes, or forced them into service. They'd survived the cramped, disease-filled decks of navy ships where flogging was common, food was barely edible, and their voices meant nothing. So when they turned pirate, they changed the rules. Every man on a pirate ship had a vote. If the captain acted arrogant or abusive, he could be removed. Shares of loot were divided according to agreed terms. and if a man lost an arm or leg in battle, he received compensation, sometimes more than a poor laborer would earn in years. These ideas didn't come from idealism. They came from survival. A united crew was stronger, faster, and less likely to break during battle. But the effect of those rules created a kind of floating democracy, one that echoed across Nassau like an unofficial constitution. Still, not all pirates were the same. Some captains, like Benjamin Hornigold, still held onto their old values and refused to attack English ships. Others, like Charles Vane, were hot-tempered and violent, ready to burn any vessel that crossed their path. And then there was Blackbeard, clever, theatrical, always calculating how to turn fear into an advantage. These men didn't always agree, but Nassau provided enough space, socially and physically, for their differences. Now, beyond the town, the forests of New Providence wrapped the settlement in dense green shadows. Pirates sometimes slipped into the jungle to hide stolen goods, bury loot, or rest after long voyages. The island wasn't large, but it felt like a world unto itself. Untamed, humid, filled with bird calls and rustling leaves. The smell of pine wood mixed with salt air in a way that was strangely soothing. At night, the shoreline flickered with firelight. Pirates sat in circles, passing bottles, telling stories that grew bolder with each retelling. Some nights, the entire island felt like a single drifting, laughing campfire. Other nights, the wind carried the sound of pistol shots or sharp arguments, nothing too unusual for a place crowded with strong personalities. And over time, Nassau gained a kind of rhythm. A ship would sail out toward the open sea, disappear for weeks, then return loaded with spoils. Men would unload cargo, divide shares, repair sails, and prepare for the next chase. Meanwhile, new sailors, runaways, deserters, fugitives, kept trickling in, drawn by the promise of freedom and easy wealth. But every bright flame casts a shadow, and one of those shadows came in the form of a problem the pirates didn't fully expect. Hunger. New Providence didn't have farmland. No big plantations, no abundant livestock, no stable food supply. The settlement relied heavily on passing ships for meat, grain, and fresh vegetables. When pirates disrupted trade routes, fewer merchant ships passed by. And when fewer passed by, fewer supplies reached Nassau. Some weeks the island felt almost starved. Pirates bartered, begged, or threatened their way through shortages. Sometimes they traded stolen sugar for fish. Sometimes they lived off conch and wild fruit. And sometimes they simply endured. The second threat was even quieter. European merchants and colonial officials, watching the flying gang grow more powerful, began writing letters, warnings, pleas to their governments. They demanded action. They claimed commerce was choking, that entire port cities were suffering from pirate attacks. Insurance rates climbed. Ships sailed in fear. The Caribbean economy trembled under the weight of small, fast boats that shouldn't have been able to cause so much trouble, but did. Slowly, European powers realized Nassau wasn't just an annoyance. It was a cancer, one that could spread. But in those early months, the pirates didn't feel the pressure fully. They still believed Nassau was too remote, too fortified by reefs, too wild to be retaken. They were confident, maybe too confident, that the crown had forgotten them. They were wrong. Because far across the sea, in cold offices lit by dim winter light, men with power had begun planning something. Something aimed directly at ending the pirate republic once and for all. And the first step was choosing who to send. Some locals made steady income selling supplies at inflated prices. Others avoided eye contact with the crews, knowing too well how unpredictable rum-soaked tempers could be. But even in the uneasy balance, day after day passed without collapse. Nassau functioned. Rough around the edges, loud, unpredictable, but functioning in its own strange rhythm. In the heat of afternoon, the settlement shimmered with activity. Women hung wet linens in the sun as shirtless pirates hammered loose planks back into place on the sides of their captured sloops. Children, those born to settlers and those born to pirate lovers, ran barefoot through the sandy streets, dodging crates of citrus and the heavy boots of men carrying gunpowder barrels. Laughter drifted up from the beach where several pirates used broken spars and fishing nets to improvise games, shouting at each other with playful insults that carried across the harbor. Evenings came with a different texture. The glow of lanterns spilled from tavern doorways onto the dirt paths. Music lifted from old battered violins and hammered drums beaten out of rhythm by musicians who had spent too many days at sea. Pirates leaned back in chairs, telling exaggerated stories of raids and storms until someone slammed a mug down so hard it sloshed rum across the table. The scent of roasted fish and spilled ale mixed in the air. So did the low worries, whispered only when the younger, rowdier men wandered off. Even pirates sensed the world beyond their island tightening. One of those who felt it most was Hornigold. He often stood at the edge of the dock in the quiet hours, staring across the water with his hands clasped behind his back. His crew watched him from a distance, whispering to each other that the old pirate seemed troubled. He had heard rumors spreading through merchant networks, rumors that England was preparing something. Not another proclamation, not another plea for peace, something with teeth. And as he listened to the younger pirates brag about their latest captures, especially English ships, Hornigold's jaw tightened. He knew that actions carried consequences, even if the men around him pretended the sea erased them. He feared they were pushing too far, too fast. Vane, meanwhile, sensed none of that restraint. One warm night, as the tavern roof rattled from rowdy singing, he challenged a fellow captain to a contest. Who could fire a pistol shot closest to the toe of a drunk crewman asleep on the floor? Hornigold, hearing the commotion, pushed through the crowd just in time to grab Vane's wrist before he pulled the trigger. The two men stared at each other, Vane's eyes bright with reckless amusement, Hornigold's dark with disapproval. The room went silent for a long moment. No one dared move. Then Vane jerked his wrist free, tossed the pistol aside, and laughed. The tension dissolved, but Hornigold's message lingered among the crews. The flying gang was united, but fragile. Blackbeard watched all of this with a patient, silent awareness. He didn't try to lead Nassau. He didn't try to tame it either. Instead, he studied people. He studied the quiet voices, the rumors, the way nervous merchants avoided certain waters. He sensed a shift coming, even if he couldn't yet see its shape. In those months, Nassau sat like a flame in the darkness of the Caribbean. Bright, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Captains whispered about it from Barbados to Tortuga. Royal officials complained about it from Kingston to London. Merchants rerouted their voyages to avoid the waters around it, muttering about danger and lawlessness. Every captured ship, every frightened sailor released to tell the tale, added to Nassau's legend. And with each story, the pressure on England increased. Back across the Atlantic, Woodes Rogers began gathering the fleet that would carry him to the Bahamas. The ships were stocked with food, soldiers, medicine, and the one thing the crown hoped would work: the king's official pardon for all pirates who surrendered before a set deadline. Rogers believed the offer could split the pirate community, separate the pragmatic men from the hopelessly violent ones, divide them, weaken them, neutralize Nassau without having to burn it to the ground. But Rogers also prepared for the possibility that negotiations would fail. He hired skilled marines. He requested extra weapons. He studied maps of New Providence with the cautious precision of a man who had learned long ago that the ocean rewarded preparation and punished arrogance. Meanwhile, the pirates at Nassau had no idea that a fleet bearing their possible salvation, or their destruction, was being fitted for sail. They argued over stolen treasure, drank through the night, patched their ships, planned new raids, and clung to the belief that the world beyond didn't have the strength or will to challenge them. For now, the harbor still glittered peacefully under the moonlight. For now, laughter still rang from the taverns. For now, the flying gang still moved freely in their island kingdom. But the calm had a brittle edge, and soon the wind would shift. While Woodes Rogers made his steady, determined journey across the Atlantic, the rhythm of Nassau continued with the same raw pulse it always had. Daylight brought the usual scramble of activity. Crews patching sails with whatever cloth they had, Carpenters repairing damaged planks with mismatched wood, boys running messages between ships and taverns. Ropes creaked, hammers knocked, and voices rose in an ever-changing chorus that drifted across the harbor. Pirates rarely stayed still. Even on land they moved with a restless energy, pacing, arguing, bartering, sharpening blades. The scent of tar and seaweed mixed with smoke from small cooking fires where men roasted fish caught earlier in the morning. Some gathered in circles gambling with dice carved from bones, their laughter sharp and rough. Others sat alone, carving small wooden shapes or mending torn clothing, quiet tasks that kept their hands busy after months at sea. Despite all the noise, there was a strange order beneath the surface. Certain captains held influence, certain taverns were considered safe, and certain unspoken rules shaped daily life. One of those rules was simple but sacred. Nassau was a refuge. No one stole from another pirate here. Arguments could explode, threats could fly, but stealing inside the Republic itself was seen as a betrayal of the fragile brotherhood they'd built. Those who broke that rule were dealt with harshly, sometimes exiled, sometimes beaten, sometimes worse. That unwritten law kept a kind of stability in a place that should have collapsed into chaos. Still, signs of strain flickered in the air. Food shortages pressed harder some weeks than others. When too many ships chased prizes too far afield, supplies on New Providence thinned. Rum often flowed more freely than fresh water. Some pirates began planting small gardens behind their huts, though the sandy soil offered little. Others made deals with small boats from Eleuthera or Spanish wells, trading stolen goods for fruit, salt pork or grain. And through all this, the factions among the flying gang kept shifting. Hornigold's followers preferred discipline and caution. Vane's men relished risk and violence. Blackbeard's crew admired strategy, showmanship, and intelligence. Word traveled fast after every voyage. Who had taken what ship, who had lost a prize, who had treated prisoners fairly or cruelly. Reputation mattered more here than wealth. A skilled navigator or gunner could choose his captain. A captain who gambled away crew shares or ignored injuries could lose everything. What made Nassau unique wasn't its freedom, it was its accountability. Even in lawlessness, they enforced their own kind of order. But none of this mattered to the governments watching from across the sea. In their eyes, Nassau wasn't a brave social experiment or a floating democracy. It was a threat, danger, a nest of criminals who disrupted shipping lanes and drained wealth from the empire's arteries. And that threat only grew. Because as months passed and more privateers from the war drifted into piracy, the flying gang's presence stretched into new waters. Their influence expanded all the way up the North American coast. Ships traveling near the Carolinas watched warily for fast-moving pirate sloops rising over the horizon. Merchants carrying sugar, cocoa, indigo, or timber knew that their cargo could vanish in a single encounter. Even well-armed vessels feared being boarded by men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The stories spread quickly. Rumors grew into legends. A captain swore he saw a ship approach with lanterns glowing eerily around its masts. Blackbeard's signal. A merchant claimed Charles Vane threatened to burn his vessel even after surrender. Another told of a crew spared by a surprisingly polite pirate, who apologized for the inconvenience before taking all their rum and sailing away. Each tale, exaggerated or not, added weight to the growing panic across colonial ports. Yet in Nassau itself, these tales simply became fuel for pride. Pirates toasted their own success, bragged about near escapes, laughed about frightened merchants. They saw themselves as survivors in a world stacked against them, and for a time it felt like they were winning. But slow shifts began to ripple through the settlement. One day, a ship arrived with news. English authorities had issued something called the King's Pardon. It offered legal forgiveness to pirates who surrendered peacefully by a certain deadline. Many pirates scoffed at the idea. Others listened quietly, considering. A few captains debated whether it could be real or merely bait. The pardon wasn't invented out of mercy. It was a strategy. England hoped pirates would lay down arms voluntarily, weakening Nassau before any military force arrived. And while many rejected it immediately, the idea planted seeds of doubt, especially among men who were aging, injured, or tired of the constant chase. You could feel it on certain nights. Pirates staring a little longer into their rum cups, wondering what would happen if they accepted the king's offer. Others refused to even consider it, calling the idea betrayal. This tension hummed beneath the surface like a low drumbeat. Meanwhile, the flying gang captains continued meeting on ships, in taverns, or in the shade of old buildings. Their conversations grew sharper. Hornigold wanted order. Vane wanted rebellion. Rackham craved opportunity. Blackbeard analyzed every angle, silent more often than not, thinking his way through new possibilities. But even though the pardon stirred unease, most pirates still believed Nassau was too remote to be retaken. The British government didn't have enough money, enough ships, or enough motivation. At least that's what they hoped. Yet Woodes Rogers kept sailing. His fleet cut through rough waters, carrying soldiers, supplies, and the official documents of his authority. He wrote letters on the journey, finalizing plans for how to rebuild the settlement once he arrived. Investors had placed heavy trust in him. The crown demanded results. Merchants expected relief. And Rogers knew every day counted. But even he didn't fully understand what he was sailing toward. Nassau wasn't simply a colony gone rogue. It was an entire culture, built from shared grievances, shared goals, and shared dreams of freedom. It wasn't easily cowed, and it wouldn't collapse quietly. And as Rogers' ships neared the Caribbean, as the sunlight grew hotter and the water clearer, Nassau's residents continued living as if nothing were changing. They hunted prizes. They shared rum. They sharpened knives. They argued. They laughed. But winds shift. Tides change. And the future, silent, invisible, unstoppable, was already drawing closer to the sandy shores of New Providence. The first sign that something was changing came quietly, almost too softly for anyone to take it seriously. A merchant sloop, battered and missing half its railing, slipped into the harbor one afternoon under a white flag made from torn sailcloth. The few people on the beach barely noticed at first. Damaged ships came into Nassau all the time, and flags claiming surrender or peace often meant nothing. Pirates had long ago learned that desperate men lied. But this vessel was different. It wasn't running from pirates. It was running from something else. A handful of Nassau settlers walked down to the shoreline, squinting at the sunlit water as the sloop approached. When it finally anchored and the crew rowed to shore, their pale, anxious faces caught the attention of a few pirates lounging under the awning of a rum stall. The sailors stumbled out of the boat as though their legs refused to trust the land beneath them. One man leaned heavily on another, shaking as he spoke. His words came out in broken pieces. Something about patrol ships, something about England preparing a fleet, something about a man named Rogers. But the pirates nearby laughed it off. Rum loosened their skepticism, and Nassau's comfort made them careless. Rumors came and went like ocean tides, carried by terrified sailors who had escaped capture or storms or their own imagination. Fear made ordinary men exaggerate, and pirates knew that better than anyone, so the warnings were ignored. Even when the frightened merchant captain insisted he had seen the preparations with his own eyes. New cannons, fresh supplies, soldiers drilling on the docks. Most pirates brushed the news aside. They didn't want to believe danger was creeping closer. They didn't want to imagine their freedom was temporary. They simply shook their heads, waved the man off, and returned to their cups. But not everyone dismissed the story. Hornigold listened carefully. He stood with his arms folded, watching the merchant captain tremble as he tried to steady his breath. When the man described how the English officials spoke of Nassau as a nest of vipers, Hornigold's expression hardened. When he mentioned proclamations and deadlines and something about a promise of mercy if the pirates surrendered, Hornigold's gaze drifted toward the harbor, thoughtful, distant. Later that evening, when most of Nassau settled into its usual murmur of tavern noise and firelight, Hornigold sought out Blackbeard. He found him sitting on a low stool outside a small shack near the shore, quietly sharpening the edge of a cutlass. The soft scraping of metal on stone filled the silence between them. Hornigold relayed the merchant's story, keeping his voice low so the rowdy laughter from the nearby tavern wouldn't drown out the details. Blackbeard didn't interrupt. He simply continued sharpening, his movements steady, slow, patient. When the story was finished, he set the blade down across his lap. He didn't call the merchant a liar. He didn't call the story an exaggeration. Instead, he breathed out slowly through his nose and looked toward the harbor lights flickering across the water. He knew the world enough to recognize when pressure was building. He had felt small shifts like this before, just faint ripples at first, then stronger, until the sea itself seemed to tilt under the weight of change. And this rumor had that same unsettling gravity. Word spread through the island quietly, carried not by shouts but by hushed conversations behind tavern walls. Some pirates shrugged it away. Others tightened their belts, not out of fear but out of curiosity. A few, especially the older ones who had seen too many wars, began checking the conditions of their weapons more often. Still, there was no consensus. Nassau was too full of contradictions to move as one. Vane, as expected, mocked the entire idea. He stood on a crate outside the tavern one night, shouting loud enough to draw a crowd. He waved a bottle overhead as he called England weak, claiming their threats had no bite. He ranted that no admiral, no governor, no official could tame Nassau. The crowd cheered, fueled by liquor and bravado, slamming their mugs against each other in defiant rhythm. Yet behind the shouts, some faces remained troubled. When lightning flashed over the distant horizon, a few men instinctively glanced toward the sea, as though expecting to see sails materializing in the dark. Meanwhile, in the quieter corners of the settlement, life continued in its small, practical ways. A woman patched torn clothing using a needle made from whalebone. A couple of settlers reinforced the walls of their small home, finally making repairs they had put off for months. Older pirates sat on overturned barrels and talked about their youth, how years ago they had sailed under commanders who did not tolerate insubordination. They spoke of flogging posts, strict watches, meager pay, and how joining piracy had felt like stepping into sunlight after years locked below deck. None of them wanted to return to that life. But none of them could deny that the merchant's warning tapped into something deeper than fear, tapped into memory. Still, the nights continued to glow with firelight. Still, the sound of drunken singing drifted over the sand. Still, the scent of roasting fish mixed with warm Caribbean wind. Nassau didn't change overnight. But there was something new beneath the surface now. A subtle edge, a tension that curled around the edges of every conversation. The flying gang continued to raid ships in the surrounding waters. They returned with barrels of tobacco, kegs of flour, crates of cloth, stacks of Spanish coins. And every time they celebrated another victory, someone in the room whispered about the rumor. Someone mentioned the name Rogers. Someone wondered aloud whether the Crown would really send a fleet big enough to challenge Nassau. Most dismissed the worry. But Hornigold didn't. Blackbeard didn't. A quiet handful of thoughtful men didn't. They felt the pressure building like humidity before a storm. And the storm, though still far away, was already forming. Rumors kept circling through Nassau like seabirds riding warm air. One day the warnings felt distant and harmless. The next they clung to conversations like humidity. No one could quite ignore them anymore. Not even the boldest among the flying gang. Something was shifting, subtle but undeniable, like the faint pull of a tide changing direction before dawn. But in the meantime, life in Nassau remained loud, loose, and unpredictable. The beach was a constant blur of motion. Pirates hauled barrels to and from ships, dragging them through sand that clung stubbornly to their boots. Small fires crackled along the shoreline as crews cooked salted pork or split fish open to lay them over glowing embers. Laughter rose in sudden bursts, strange and sharp, echoing off the broken timbers of half-collapsed buildings. Some men slept on the beach without a care in the world, arms tucked under their heads, rum bottles empty beside them. Despite the rumors, there was no real order, no sign of fear in the open air. But deeper inside Nassau, in the dim corners where the noise didn't reach, the conversations grew heavier. In one of the most weather-worn taverns, nothing more than a sagging roof propped up by driftwood, Hornigold gathered a small circle of trusted sailors. The flickering flame from a single lantern lit their faces unevenly, casting long shadows on the table. He spoke simply, without dramatic flourish. He explained that he had known the crown to be slow but not forgetful, that England didn't tolerate embarrassment for long, that the Caribbean trade routes were too important to allow Nassau's chaos to continue, and that a man like Woodes Rogers, calm, disciplined, committed, would not take no for an answer. The men around him listened, their eyes shifting from the lantern to Hornigold's face. Each understood the unspoken truth. The crown would not send a single ship or two. They would send enough force to crush Nassau if negotiations failed. Enough to wipe out the Republic of Pirates entirely. But Hornigold wasn't calling for surrender. Not yet. He was thinking strategically, as he always had. He suggested rebuilding defenses, preparing escape routes, reinforcing loyalty among crews. He talked about possibly convincing other captains to limit unnecessary violence on raids, anything that might strengthen their position if negotiations began. The men nodded, but they also glanced toward the door, as if afraid someone might overhear. Meanwhile, the one man who absolutely wouldn't listen to caution was Charles Vane. That same night, while Hornigold was deep in strategy with his closest allies, Vane sat at another tavern entirely, one built sturdier, louder, and filled with the kind of men drawn to chaos. He slammed his fist on a table hard enough to rattle mugs, claiming that England didn't have the nerve to enforce its laws in the Caribbean. He insisted that any fleet sent their way could be outmaneuvered, burned, or driven off just like so many others. He waved his arms, pacing between tables with the restless energy of someone who thrived on conflict. The men around him roared with approval. They believed him because he made them feel invincible, because he gave them permission to ignore the quiet dread that followed the rumor of Rogers like a shadow. Vane's speeches grew wilder, his voice thick with drink but confident as ever. At one point he even claimed that Nassau itself was blessed by fate, protected by the shallows and reefs that would tear apart any large navy ship daring to approach. It wasn't completely wrong. Nassau's geography was difficult, but his arrogance twisted truth into shield. The more he shouted, the more the crowd pounded the tables. And the more they pounded, the more Nassau fell into two invisible camps. The thoughtful few who sensed danger coming, and the ones who drowned fear in noise and rum. Blackbeard, as always, kept to the edges. He watched both sides quietly, drifting between gatherings like a shadow. He listened to Hornigold's calculations, then wondered to hear Vane's bravado. He didn't correct either man. He didn't encourage either side. He simply observed. Blackbeard had always understood the seas better than most men. He knew storms could appear without warning and strike hard enough to break masts. But he also knew that panic made sailors clumsy. He sensed Nassau standing on that same knife edge, needing caution but not fear, needing calm but not blindness. So he stayed silent. Outside, night deepened. Wind brushed over the settlement, carrying scents of charcoal, salt water, and wet wood. Lanterns flickered on porches. A few pirates sang in broken harmony, their voices drifting over the sand. And in the distance, faint lightning flashed again. But it wasn't from a storm. It was too structured, too sharp, more like the glint of something reflecting moonlight at sea. Only the most attentive noticed it. A boy gathering driftwood near the waterline, a fisherman mending nets in the dark, an older pirate with failing eyesight who blinked, then shook his head, thinking it a trick of memory. Far offshore, barely visible, a cluster of dark shapes rested against the horizon. They weren't close enough to be identified. Not yet. They floated still, silent, almost blending into the dusk. But they were there, watching, waiting. No one in Nassau knew that Woodes Rogers had already left England. No one knew that his fleet had already crossed the Atlantic. No one knew that letters had been sent to other governors, calling for cooperation and supplies. And certainly no one knew that dozens of Marines rested below deck, preparing for the moment Nassau would hear the blast of their cannons. For now, Nassau still breathed freely, unaware it was living its last months in the golden age of its independence. The Republic of Pirates still laughed, still drank, still sang beneath the warm Caribbean sky. But the world beyond it was no longer sleeping. It was coming. As dawn crept slowly across Nassau, the settlement woke with its usual uneven rhythm. A few men were up early, stumbling out to wash their faces in the tide, grunting at the brightness. Others snored so loudly in the sandy alleys that passing goats paused to stare at them. Ships rocked gently in the harbor, ropes creaking in the breeze. For a moment, everything looked peaceful, ordinary, almost comfortable. But on the far horizon, those vague shadows remained. Most pirates didn't notice, and even if they had, they wouldn't have cared. Ships came and went constantly. The Caribbean Sea was full of silhouettes, mirages, false shapes made by heat and light. The horizon played tricks often. Men trusted what was near, not what flickered far away. Inside Nassau, the morning routine unfolded the way it had for years. A group of sailors dragged a battered sloop onto the shallows to scrape barnacles off the hull. Two women at a rum stall set out wooden cups, counting quietly under their breath as they arranged them. Someone thumped a cracked drum for no reason at all. A pair of men argued over a dice game left over from the night before, each claiming the other had cheated. Somewhere a rooster crowed, sounding confused and irritated. But beneath all these small, ordinary sounds, the island carried a faint tension. It wasn't spoken aloud. It wasn't in the posture of the men or the angle of the sails. It was more like a vibration, thin and low, sitting under everything as if the ground knew something the people didn't. In the mid-morning heat, a sloop belonging to Calico Jack Rackham glided back into Nassau harbor after a short raid. Rackham stood on deck with his usual loose posture, hands on his belt, a borrowed hat tilted on his head. His grin was smug but small, almost absent-minded, as if something had tugged at his thoughts during the journey home. And Bonnie stood beside him, leaning against the railing with her arms crossed. Her sharp eyes swept the shoreline, noticing the mood felt off. Not panicked, not fearful, just unsettled. She nudged Rackham gently with her elbow. "You feel that?" she asked, keeping her voice low so the crew couldn't hear. Rackham shrugged at first, but then he paused. He did feel something. Something like the quiet before a ship changes course. "Yeah," he muttered. Like the island's holding its breath. And didn't smile. She was younger than most pirates in Nassau, but sharper than half the men twice her age. She trusted instinct over rumor, and her instinct told her that Nassau's days of freedom were shifting, even if she couldn't yet see how. Elsewhere on the island, Hornigold was already planning. He walked through the settlement with a slow, steady step, pausing to talk with men he trusted. He asked simple questions. "How's your ship? How many pistols do you have? Are your powder stores dry?" But the meaning behind those questions was clear. He expected change. He expected conflict. And he wanted Nassau ready. Some men listened seriously. Others tried to wave him off, claiming he worried too much. A few even mocked him lightly, saying the sea always delivered warnings, and most ended up being nothing but shadows on the horizon. Still, Hornigold kept walking, kept asking, kept preparing. Blackbeard, meanwhile, spent the morning in quiet repair work. He knelt on the deck of his sloop, tightening one of the stays with slow, deliberate motions. His crew moved around him, respectful and efficient, watching their captain out of the corners of their eyes as if studying him for clues. Everyone knew that Blackbeard felt shifts at sea faster than most men. He read the world in small signs: winds, currents, silences, the behavior of birds. When one sailor approached and asked lightly, "Captain, something wrong?" Blackbeard didn't look up. He pulled the rope tighter, checked the tension with his thumb, and said quietly, "Sea's changin'. Can't see how yet, but it's changin'." That was all he said. The sailor swallowed, nodded, and walked away, the words settling in him heavier than he expected. By midday the heat grew thick. Air shimmered over the sand. The rum stalls were busy again. Someone hammered nails into a half-finished shed, each strike echoing like a heartbeat. Groups formed here and there. Men sharing stories, sharpening cutlasses, dividing loot, trading stolen silk for tobacco. But on the edge of the crowd, one local fisherman paused mid-step. He had been staring out to sea, shading his eyes with his hand. His brow furrowed. He blinked once, twice, then rubbed his eyes. He wasn't a pirate, just a man who knew the ocean intimately, someone who had spent more hours staring at the horizon than most sailors had spent on deck. He saw something unusual. The dark shapes were still out there. But now they were a little larger. Not closer, just clearer. His chest tightened. He knew the silhouette of merchant ships. He knew the posture of privateer sloops. He knew the heavy shape of Spanish galleons. These weren't any of those. They were broader, straighter in their lines. Their masts were tall and evenly spaced. Their hulls sat deeper in the water than anything Nassau usually saw. He knew what that meant. He knew it with a certainty that made his stomach drop. They were ships of war. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He simply lowered his hand and took a slow breath, letting the warm air fill his lungs. Then he turned away from the ocean and began walking inland toward the cluster of taverns where the pirates gathered. He wasn't a brave man, nor a reckless one. He was simply someone who understood that the horizon doesn't lie. Inside the taverns, arguments were growing more heated. Men were dividing into sides without realizing it. Those who wanted to prepare, and those who still believed Nassau was untouchable. Voices rose. Tankards slammed down. Someone cursed loudly across the room, the sound sharp enough to make a few heads turn. And in the doorway, the fisherman stepped inside. The noise washed over him. The smell of rum and sweat filled the air. But he lifted his hand slowly, trying to catch someone's attention. Not because he wanted drama, but because someone had to say it. Someone had to break the illusion. Someone had to tell Nassau that the shadows on the horizon were not shadows at all. At first, no one noticed the fisherman standing there. Pirates argued over dice, over rum, over who had taken whose boots the previous night. A few men lounged at tables half asleep, heads tipped back, hats covering their eyes. Someone near the bar was loudly attempting to sing, getting every line wrong but insisting he was right. It was the usual cacophony of Nassau. Messy, careless, confident. The fisherman raised his hand a little higher. "Oi, someone," he said, his voice steady but thin. One of the men closest to the door finally looked over, annoyed at being interrupted mid-story. "What's it then? You look like you swallowed a crab." The fisherman didn't step in further. He didn't shout. He just said the words plainly. "There are ships comin'," he murmured. "Warships." First nothing changed. The tavern kept moving at its usual rhythm. Men drinking, arguing, laughing. A tankard clattered. Someone groaned at losing a card game. The man who was singing switched to an entirely unrelated tune. But the few pirates who had heard the fisherman, they went still. And silence spread strangely in a tavern. It begins with a few quiet breaths, a few stilled hands, a few eyes turning sharply. One man stopped mid-laugh. Another froze with his cup halfway to his mouth. The singing faltered like a candle about to go out. Then a single voice cut through the room. "What kind of ships?" The fisherman swallowed. "Royal Navy." That name had weight. Even men who feared little felt it land in their bones. The Royal Navy meant discipline, cannons, officers who didn't negotiate with pirates unless forced. The Royal Navy meant a change larger than rumor, larger than fear. And in moments the room shifted. Not into panic, but into a taut, electric stillness. A big man with braided hair stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping the floor. "How many?" "Dunno exact," the fisherman replied. "But more than one. Not a sloop or a patrol. Proper English warships. Big ones." Stillness deepened. Men looked around the tavern as though seeing it differently. Its crooked beams, its patched walls, its open, vulnerable doors. For years Nassau had been a haven, a refuge, a kingdom built from driftwood and stolen gold. But warships, those didn't drift. They didn't wander. They arrived with purpose. Someone slipped out the door to see for themselves. A moment later someone else followed. Then 5 more. Then half the tavern emptied, boots thudding across sand toward the shoreline. The fisherman remained in the doorway, watching as the news carried on the wind, reaching the next tavern, the next group of men. Conversations died. Eyes lifted. Voices sharpened with suspicion or disbelief. But the sea didn't lie, and one by one, pirates began heading toward the harbor. By the time the crowd gathered near the beach, the heat had grown thick enough to make the air ripple like water. Men shaded their eyes. Women carrying baskets stopped walking mid-step. Children paused their games and inched closer to see what everyone was staring at. From the shore, the horizon looked deceptively calm. But the ships were there. Now closer. Now clearer. Not merchant silhouettes. Not privateer shapes. Tall-masted. White-hulled. Built for endurance. Built for battle. A murmur rolled through the crowd. A low wave of unease. "They ain't Spanish," someone said. "Not French neither. No patrol flies that many sails." Then Blackbeard arrived. He walked through the crowd with slow, measured steps, his height and presence drawing men aside without a word. His dark coat brushed the sand. His braided beard moved slightly in the breeze, fuses tucked but unlit. He stopped at the shore, staring straight toward the horizon. For a long moment he said nothing. Rackham and Bonny stood nearby, both watching him closely. Hornigold approached from the opposite side, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression tense but thoughtful. Finally Blackbeard spoke. "They're comin' for Nassau," he murmured, and turned her head. "You sure?" "Aye." The word hung in the air, heavy enough to pull every set of shoulders downward. Hornigold exhaled slowly. "Rogers," he whispered. "It has to be Rogers. They said London was sendin' a governor, a man to tame the island." "No one believed it," Rackham muttered. "No one wanted to," Hornigold answered. Around them, the pirates of Nassau stood in uneasy silence. Some squinted at the ships, searching for flags. Others muttered nervously, unsure whether to prepare for a fight or flee inland. A few younger men boasted bravely, but their hands trembled when they thought no one was watching. Only one man's expression hardened with something colder than fear. Charles Vane. He stepped forward, jaw tight, eyes narrowed with defiance. "Let him come," he growled. "We've got guns, powder, and men who ain't afraid to die. I say we strike first. Burn the first ship, send the rest fleeing." Hornigold shot him a sharp look. "You'd doom us all." Vane laughed bitterly. "Surrendering will doom us quicker." Blackbeard didn't intervene. He stood quiet, as if listening to the sea. Bonny stepped closer, her voice steady. "It's not a patrol, Vane. It's not a lone frigate you can scare off with a bit of fire. It's a fleet." Vane sneered. "And what? We roll over? Ask forgiveness like dogs?" "No," Anne said. "But we don't pretend we can win a war with 3 cannons and half a box of powder." The crowd shifted again. Men looked from one captain to another, searching for direction, for clarity, for someone willing to make the first decision. Finally Hornigold spoke, his voice firm. "We need a council. Tonight. Every captain. Every quartermaster. We decide together." The murmurs grew louder. Some nodded eagerly, relieved. Others hesitated, glancing back at the sea. Because the ships were closer still. Not close enough to threaten, but close enough to promise. Close enough that Nassau's days of freedom were no longer drifting clouds or distant shadows. They were hours away. As the sun began sinking toward late afternoon, Nassau shifted into a strange, uneasy rhythm. Men who usually lounged lazily on crates now moved with sharp, clipped gestures. Women at the rum stalls poured drinks without chatter. Even the gulls circling overhead seemed quieter, as if the air itself had thickened around the island. The warships, still far yet undeniably approaching, had changed everything. They hovered on the horizon like a line of dark teeth, faint but unmistakable. And the pirates felt the pressure of those silhouettes as surely as a storm front pushing wind ahead of its arrival. By dusk the captains gathered. They met not in a tavern, but in the open clearing behind the harbor, neutral ground where no crew held advantage. Torches flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the sand. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and something else. Something metallic and anxious. A rough circle formed. Quartermasters stood behind their captains. Crewmen lingered at the edges, whispering quietly. Blackbeard stood tall and still, hands clasped at his back. Hornigold kept his posture straight, his jaw set. Rackham shifted restlessly, unable to keep his boots in one place. And Bonnie stood behind him with her arms crossed, eyes sharp as flint. Charles Vane paced the edge of the firelight, shoulders tense, teeth clenched. When Hornigold raised his hand, the murmurs died away. Words confirmed, he said. Crowns send in a governor, a man named Woods Rogers. He's bringin' a full pardon for any pirate willing to lay down arms, and a fleet to force those who won't. A ripple went through the crowd, part disbelief, part anger, part fear. Rackham snorted quietly. A pardon, he muttered, for the crown that left us starvin' in the first place. But Hornigold continued. It's real. The pardon's been mentioned in letters from Carolina traders, from captains near Bermuda. And Rogers. He's not some soft-bellied noble. He's a privateer. A hunter. Blackbeard spoke then, his voice low, steady. A hunter's only dangerous if you stand still. Heads turned toward him. Some men nodded. Others frowned. Everyone listened. Charles Vane stepped forward, sweeping his arm toward the distant sea. We don't wait for 'em. We fight. Nassa's ours. We built it. No king's man gets to stroll in and take it like a prize. Several men raised their voices in agreement. Someone slammed a fist into their palm. Someone else shouted, "Aye. Fight!" The fire sputtered as if reacting to the flare of temper. But Hornigold answered sharply. Fight with what? Powder's low. Half our guns are rusted. You act like the Navy'll roll over because we shout loud. They have discipline, numbers, and orders. We can't win against that. Vane glared at him. Cowardice ain't strategy. And stupidity ain't bravery. And shot back before Hornigold could. Vane turned on her. Careful, girl. She's not wrong, Rackham added, stepping slightly in front of her, though she hadn't needed him to. Tension tightened the space between the captains like a drawn rope. Blackbeard moved then. Not aggressively, just stepping forward one deliberate pace. Enough to draw every eye. Enough to make Vane pause. We're arguing over two choices, Blackbeard said quietly. Fight or flee. A bitter chuckle rose from somewhere in the circle, but it died quickly. If we fight, Blackbeard continued, men will die. Many. Nassau ain't a fort. We're exposed. And Rogers didn't come for a skirmish. He came to crush what we built. And flee where? A rough voice called from the back. Run to the Spanish. They'll hang us. French. No place left. A few murmurs of agreement hummed through the clearing. And stepped forward, her voice calm despite the tension. There are islands farther south. Little ones, claimed. Some havens pirates use quietly. We could scatter, make new ports, and give up Nassau. Vane barked. Give up the one place that's ours. Over my dead carcass. Careful with wishin', someone muttered. Vane ignored it. We can fight, he insisted. We have speed. Surprise. The Navy's slow. Heavy. We hit him at night. Burn one ship. Disable another. Rogers'll think twice if we sink his teeth before he bites. But Hornigold shook his head. He's not here to think twice. He's here to end piracy. Burn one ship and the Crown will send 10 more. Silence fell. Heavy. Crushed under the weight of truth. Blackbeard's face remained unreadable. Rackham looked restless. And looked thoughtful. Hornigold looked tired. Only Vane still looked furious. We're pirates, Vane growled. Ain't that mean anything anymore? We didn't bow to governors. We didn't kneel to kings. We took what we needed, lived how we wanted. And now you're all speakin' like scared merchants. He pointed toward the harbor. Those ships ain't here yet. We strike now. Hornigold's voice dropped, quiet but firm. If you try, you'll start a war none of us agreed to. And you'll lose. Vane sneered. Better to die fightin' than live beggin'. But Blackbeard finally turned his head toward Vane, eyes dark and calm. Better to live smart, he said. The wind shifted then, carrying the faintest scent of distant gunpowder. Maybe imagined, maybe real. The torches flickered. A few men looked to the horizon again, as if expecting the ships to have doubled in number. The council fractured into murmurs. Some captains leaned toward Hornigold, others toward Vane. A few looked to Blackbeard, waiting for him to choose a side. But Blackbeard said nothing more. He simply looked out to sea, as though already planning 10 steps ahead of everyone. Finally, Hornigold spoke again. Dawn, he said. We meet again at dawn. Choose your course by then, pardon flight or fight. But tonight, keep your men calm. No one fires a shot. No one makes a move. The circle slowly broke apart. Some captains walked away stiff and silent. Others whispered fiercely with their crews. Vane stalked off into the darkness, muttering curses under his breath. Rackham exhaled shakily and rubbed his face, and placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. Blackbeard lingered a moment longer, staring at the warship's silhouettes. They'll reach us soon, he murmured. Hornigold nodded grimly. Aye. And Nassau'll change when they do. Blackbeard didn't turn. Nassau's already changed. And behind them, the torches hissed softly, their flames twisting like serpents under the salt-heavy wind. Marking the night the island's freedom began to crack. Night settled over Nassau with a heaviness that felt almost physical, as though the darkness itself understood the weight of the hours ahead. Torches dimmed, voices lowered. Even the waves against the shore seemed to hush themselves, their rhythm quieter, more cautious. It was the kind of night where sound carried too easily, where every footstep felt louder than it should. And in that tense darkness, the pirates drifted into uneasy clusters, some drinking in silence, others pacing, others staring at the horizon as if their eyes could stop dawn from coming. Inside one of the battered taverns, Rackham sat at a rough wooden table, turning a cup of rum between his palms. The drink barely touched. His thoughts spun too fast for the liquor to settle. And Bonnie sat across from him, boot braced against the leg of the table, arms crossed tightly. She watched him with a stillness that contrasted sharply with the restless men around them. "You're thinkin' too loud," she muttered. Rackham let out a thin breath. "Just feels like a door's closin'. One we didn't even notice swingin' behind us." And didn't answer at first. She glanced at the open doorway where warm lamplight spilled onto the sand. Outside someone laughed, a quick, sharp burst that sounded more like nerves than humor. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "We survived worse," she said. "Storms. Near hangings. We'll survive this too." Rackham held her gaze for a moment, then looked back down at his drink. "I know. But I ain't just thinkin' about surviving. I'm thinkin' about what comes after." Her expression softened, barely. "We'll adapt. But first we make it through tomorrow." Not far away, in the cool night air near the harbor, Blackbeard walked along the shoreline with slow, measured steps. His boots sank lightly into the damp sand. His crew hung back respectfully, giving their captain space to think. He stopped at the water's edge and stared toward the dark horizon where those warships waited like silent beasts. He spoke without turning. "Storms come and One of his men swallowed hard. "Aye, Captain." Blackbeard didn't move, didn't blink. He seemed to be listening to something only he could hear. The distant groan of timbers, the thrum of tension in the wind, the quiet dread rising through the island like mist. "Men'll choose different paths come dawn," he murmured. "Some will take the pardon, some will run, some will fight." He paused, voice dropping softer. "But whatever path they choose, none'll keep Nassau the way it is." Behind him, waves gently reached for the shore and fell back again. Meanwhile, across the settlement, Hornigold sat at a small desk inside his hut, writing by the flicker of a single candle. His handwriting was steady, controlled, like the man himself. He wasn't writing a letter to England. No point. They already knew where he stood. Instead, he was listing supplies. Powder stores, shot counts, food stockpiles, water reserves, ship conditions. He paused often, rubbing the bridge of his nose, aware that the numbers were too low, too scattered, too unreliable to face what approached them. He had warned the men for months, had tried to impose discipline. But pirates were not soldiers. They were free men, proud men, stubborn men. They followed rules when it suited them, ignored them when it didn't. Now the lack of structure showed its teeth. Hornigold dipped his quill again, but his hand hesitated before touching the page. In that brief pause, his face changed, softened, sagged slightly, as if the candle's glow revealed just how deeply he'd cared for this fragile, unlikely republic. He whispered to the empty room. "Should have done more." Outside, voices rose suddenly, sharp, angry. He closed the ledger and stepped out into the night. Near the center of Nassau, Charles Vane stood with a knot of men who shared his restlessness. They were half drunk, not from celebration, but from the need to smother fear with fire. Vane held a torch in one hand, pacing fiercely. "We strike now," he growled. "Before dawn. Before Rogers lands. Take the fight to him, and send them running back to England with their tails tucked." A scruffy pirate leaned in close. "But Captain, the others won't join." Vane rounded on him. "Then they'll kneel like dogs." "But I ain't kneelin'," another voice murmured. "If we act alone, the others'll turn on us." Vane glared. "Then let him try." He tossed the torch into the sand, its flame sputtering dangerously near a dry barrel before someone kicked sand over it. Vane's crew looked at him with a mixture of admiration and deep unease. He was a fierce leader, but he was also a storm even his closest men sometimes feared. From a shadowy corner of the settlement, two men watched Vane's outburst. They exchanged a quiet look. "If he makes a move tonight," one whispered, "he'll doom us all." The other nodded. "Aye. And Rogers'll use it as excuse to burn Nassau to the ground." The men slipped away to warn Hornigold. Back at the tavern, and Rackham stepped outside into the warm night. The clouds shifted overhead, revealing a sliver of moonlight that traced the tops of the huts and glimmered faintly on the waves. And noticed something then. A group of men running toward Hornigold's hut, urgency in their movements. She nudged Rackham. "Something's brewin', He frowned. "Something always is." She didn't laugh. A moment later, Blackbeard appeared from the darkness, his steps slow but purposeful. He approached and Rackham. "Vane's stirrin' up trouble," Blackbeard said without preamble. "If he strikes tonight, Rogers'll answer with iron." Anne's jaw tightened. "Then what do we do?" "Keep the peace till dawn," Blackbeard said. "Or what's left of it." Rackham let out a humorless breath. "That means stoppin' Vane." Blackbeard didn't nod, didn't smile. Just looked toward the far end of the settlement where Vane's voice echoed faintly through the night. "Storm always takes the weakest boards first," he murmured. The three of them exchanged a glance. Silent agreement, silent worry. Then they began walking. Elsewhere, Hornigold stepped into the path of the men rushing toward him. Hearing their news, reading the fear beneath their words, he didn't waste time. He grabbed his pistol belt, slung it over his shoulder, and headed out into the night. By then, the clouds had thickened again, covering the moon. The island grew darker. The torches burned lower. The warships on the horizon were invisible now, hidden behind darkness, distance, and the weight of what dawn would bring. But they were there, waiting, silent, certain. And Nassau, divided and restless, inched closer to the moment when every man would choose not just his fate, but the fate of the Republic of Pirates itself. The sailors on the docks that season swore the air in Nassau changed when the flying gang truly began to operate as a single, dangerous current instead of scattered, hungry sharks. You could feel it in the way men lifted their heads whenever they heard boots scraping across the planks, wondering if it was Vane with his unpredictable temper, or Rackham with those sharp, calculating eyes, or perhaps the steady, unblinking presence of Benjamin Hornigold, who carried command the way some men carried a blade. Always ready, never flaunted. Life for the pirates was shifting, though few could see it as it happened. Every day, new ships arrived battered and gasping from long journeys, or fleeing the Spanish, the French, or even other pirates. And Nassau, wild and half-ruined, swallowed them whole. The taverns filled early. The brothels never emptied. The blacksmith's forge hammered until the coals turned white. And the governor's mansion on the hill remained silent and empty, a ghostly reminder that this island had once belonged to order. No one walked near it except stray goats and the occasional drunk who wandered too far. In those tight rooms above the tavern, men argued about sea routes and Spanish gold. On the wharf, they argued about stolen barrels of powder and who deserved how much rum. Yet somewhere in that chaos, a rhythm formed. A loose kind of democracy that no king or governor had intended. Every ship's plunder was debated. Every captain voted in or out by a show of hands. If you sat in those meetings long enough, listening to the roar of voices, the scent of spilled ale and damp wood, you'd realize something strange. For men who lived by blood and fire, these pirates believed deeply in fairness, at least among themselves. That sense of equality didn't always soften their edges. If a man stole food from a starving crew, he might find his ears sliced. If he cheated during a division of treasure, he could be marooned with a single bottle of rum and a pistol. Still, these were rules the pirates agreed to, and in a world where most sailors were beaten without reason, these strange codes felt almost righteous. When the flying gang began organizing raids together, their power cracked across the Caribbean like thunder. Their intelligence networks improved too, not from any grand design but from sheer necessity. Tavern owners overheard drunken officers discussing supply routes. Harbor wives recognized which nation's ships sailed together. Even children selling fruit on the shore learned to read the colors of distant sails and carry messages for a coin. And so it was that one humid night, as lanterns flickered low, word spread that a Spanish treasure ship, one of the smaller escorts traveling between Havana and Cartagena, had been seen limping along the horizon, damaged by storms. The news passed from lips to lips, until it reached the table where Charles Vane sat hunched, sharpening a dagger with a quick, aggressive rhythm. He stopped the moment he heard it. The tavern hushed, the air thick as syrup. "Storm damaged," Vane murmured. "Good. Means she can't outrun us." Beside him, Rackham leaned back, folding his arms, his expression thoughtful rather than eager. He was always the thinker, the planner behind the louder personalities. "Storms make men nervous," Rackham said. "A crew exhausted, sails torn. That's a ship ripe for the taking. But if she's carrying a military escort, we'll need more than brute force." Vane smirked. "Brute force is always enough." But other captains disagreed, and an argument burst across the room, slamming into the walls like a sudden gale. Voices rose, some calling for speed, others warning about hidden cannons or soldiers lying in wait. It wasn't unusual for Spanish ships to appear wounded deliberately just to lure pirates into traps. Benjamin Hornigold, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. Calm, steady but firm. "We take her together," he said. 3 ships minimum. No surprises. No lone heroes. And no firing until the flags run up. The room quieted. When Hornigold spoke, even Vane grudgingly listened. Preparations began at sunrise, every man moving with that electric twitch of anticipation that comes before a raid. The docks became a bustling storm. Barrels rolled aboard, muskets checked, powder loaded carefully to avoid sparks. Sailcloth was patched. Rope coils were thrown over shoulders. Cannons were tested by firing small warning shots into the open sea, the sound echoing across the bay. Some men joked loudly to hide their nerves. Others prayed under their breath. A few sharpened blades with shaking hands, telling themselves they weren't afraid, just excited. That was the thing about piracy. Fear and excitement lived close together, breathing the same salt air. When the fleet of the Flying Gang finally sailed out of Nassau, 3 ships flying black flags, they cut across the water like wolves scenting an injured deer. The sea was glassy that morning, the kind of stillness that made sailors wary, as though the ocean were holding its breath. Hours passed before they found her. The damaged Spanish escort ship drifting slowly eastward, sails torn and flapping like wounded wings. 2 masts were cracked, the hull scraped and splintered. She was alive, but barely. From the decks of the pirate ships, men squinted through spyglasses. They saw figures on the Spanish decks scrambling in panic, some trying to hoist fabric into place. The Spaniards weren't ready, clearly not expecting predators to descend this quickly. Hornigold's ship fired first. Not a cannonball, just a warning shot, smoke blooming into the air. Signal. A demand for surrender. But instead of white flags, the Spanish responded with fire. A volley of musket shots burst from their deck, bullets snapping across the waves. 1 pirate fell instantly. Another shouted in rage. Vane, who'd been itching for violence anyway, roared with laughter. "Well then," he growled, "let's give them what they're begging for." What followed was not one battle, but a series of frantic, chaotic clashes across decks slick with seawater and sweat. Grappling hooks flew. Cannon fire boomed from ship to ship. Men shouted orders, curses, prayers. Smoke rolled over everything in thick, choking clouds. And amidst all of it, the Flying Gang fought with that particular blend of desperation and thrill that made them so feared. The Spanish ship tried to hold its line, but the damage from the storm had robbed them of maneuverability. They were slow, heavy, and cornered. Pirates swarmed over their rails like a living tide. Swords clashed. Pistols fired at close range. Boots thudded across planks. By midday, the Spanish captain surrendered, his wounded men collapsing where they stood. The treasure wasn't enormous. Coins, small silver bars, some trade goods, but it was enough. Enough to buy rum and repairs. Enough to feed Nassau for another season. Enough to keep the pirates loyal to one another. Yet the most important treasure wasn't gold at all. It was a single map found in the Spanish quartermaster's chest, one that showed something unexpected, something the pirates would argue about for days, something that would pull them into deeper waters and far more dangerous conflicts. But that part of the tale was coming soon. The map lay unrolled on a warped tavern table, its edges held down with mugs and pistols, the parchment still smelling faintly of brine and smoke. The pirates gathered close, their faces lit unevenly by lanterns swinging overhead. Outside, Nassau buzzed with laughter and music, celebrating the Spanish capture. But inside this cramped room, the mood shifted from triumph to a tense, humming curiosity. Rackham's fingers traced a line drawn in faded ink, following a crescent-shaped chain of islands south of Cuba. "This isn't a merchant route," he murmured, almost to himself. "Not a common one, anyway. And look here, these markings. They're military symbols." Hornigold leaned in, arms crossed, jaw tight. "Escorts don't guard empty waters. The Spanish are moving something. Something they don't want noticed." Vane, sprawled in a chair with rum dripping from his beard, scoffed. "Or it's meant to trick us. Spanish love their little games." But even he couldn't hide the way his eyes flicked back to the parchment, hungry with possibility. The map showed a hidden rendezvous point, an unassuming inlet on a narrow island that looked hardly more than a strip of sand and rock. Yet 2 red X's sat near its coastline, annotated with quick scribbled notes in Spanish military shorthand. Reinforcement supply. Escort rotation. Hornigold tapped the notes thoughtfully. This is no ordinary stop. It's a staging area for something much larger. Troops, or treasure. Rackham's eyes glistened with calculation. Or both. The room grew quiet. The pirates caught between the lure of opportunity and the shadow of danger. Because attacking a lone escort ship was one thing. Going after a coordinated Spanish military operation was something else entirely. Risk. Bold one. The kind that could either elevate the flying gang into legends, or break them into scattered bones along the reefs. A low murmur rolled through the gathered captains. Arguments stirred. Some called the map a miracle. Others whispered traps and cursed Spanish trickery. But underneath all their bravado was a truth hard to ignore. The Spanish Empire didn't hide mundane business. They hid gold. And Nassau needed gold. Repairs to ships, payments to crews, bribes for informants. Everything cost coin the pirates didn't have. Their last few raids had been close calls, yielding more wounds than wealth. The men were restless, hungry, eager for a prize worthy of their growing reputation. The decision wasn't made that night. Instead, the map stayed on the table as rum flowed and tempers rose. Outside, celebrations blurred into drunken singing, the smell of roasted meat drifting through open shutters. But inside, strategy clicked into place like moving gears. Hornigold spoke with the calm authority of someone who'd spent years sailing under legitimate flags before turning rogue. If we do this, we do it clean. No rushing in blind. We scout the island first. Vane slammed his mug onto the table. Scout. By the time we're done scouting, the Spanish will have moved whatever they're hiding. And if we sail in blind, Rackham countered, we could end up at the bottom of the Caribbean. Arguments went on until dawn's pale light crept in through the shutters. By the time the sun rose, they reached a fragile consensus. They would go, but they would use stealth, patience, and discipline, qualities not always abundant among pirates. The next days moved like a tide pulling Nassau toward something big. Crews stocked fresh water and salted pork. Cannons were inspected. Gunpowder dried under the sun. Blacksmiths hammered out nails and blade repairs, sending sparks into the dusty air. Carpenters sealed cracks in hulls with tar that steamed under the heat. Dockside traders whispered about the growing preparations, sensing that something important was forming, something larger than a simple raid. Children who usually played barefoot along the pier now watched the pirates with wide, hungry eyes, sensing adventure in the wind. Ragged dogs barked at the sound of drums as men practiced musket drills. Even the waves seemed restless, slapping against the pilings with more urgency. At night, the taverns buzzed with theories. Treasure convoy, I tell you. No, escaped prisoners guarded in secret. Bah, probably just more soldiers. Every guess added fuel to the island's fever. Nassau thrived on rumors, and this one sped like fire. But out at sea, far from the chatter and the celebration, a different kind of whisper moved among the Spanish. Word of the flying gang's capture of their escort ship reached Havana faster than expected. Officers argued over how pirates managed to coordinate so efficiently. Some blamed incompetence. Others blamed storms. Others blamed the rising tide of English and French renegades who treated the Caribbean like their kingdom. One commander spoke gravely. Where there is smoke, there is fire. They know more than they should. And because of that fear, Spanish ships began to reposition. Subtle shift, quiet reinforcements. Nothing dramatic enough to broadcast panic, but enough to tighten their hold on the islands. The pirates didn't know this yet, but they could feel the tension, the way predators sense a shift in the forest. The sea itself felt heavier. 3 ships were chosen for the stealth approach. Hornigold's sturdy vessel, Rackham's sleek and fast-rigged brigantine, and Vane's violent, unpredictable craft. His men rough but loyal, his cannon crews fierce and quick-handed. Before dawn on the appointed morning, they slipped out of Nassau's harbor. No cheering crowds, no blaring horns, just the soft creaking of timbers, the flap of sails catching a pale early wind, and the low murmurs of men settling into the rhythm of the sea. During the voyage, the days blended together with that quiet, hypnotic lull that only long sailing creates. The ocean stretched out endlessly, sun glittering across it like spilled silver. Nights came soft and dark, stars dusted thick across the sky. On deck, men whispered stories of past raids or sat cleaning their pistols in the moonlight. But beneath their calm routines lived a quiet unease. The closer they came to Spanish-controlled waters, the more carefully they watched the horizon. Even Vane's loudest men kept their laughter low, alert to every ripple of water and shift of wind. On the fourth morning, a thin line of land appeared, barely visible, like a smudge of charcoal against the horizon. Rackham narrowed his eyes against the sun. "There," he said. "That's the island." The map's lines were real. The inlet existed. And now, with the sunlight rising behind them, the pirates prepared to discover whether treasure waited beyond those jagged rocks, or something far more dangerous. The island looked harmless from a distance, thin, pale, almost sleepy beneath the morning light. A narrow crescent of sand curved gently around a cluster of low hills. Sparse trees clawed upward in tangled groups, their silhouettes sharp against the sky. From far away, nothing about it suggested danger. No forts, no plumes of smoke, no movement. But the stillness itself felt unnatural. Hornigold lowered his spyglass and exhaled slowly through his nose. "Too quiet," he murmured. "The Spanish don't leave supply points unguarded." Rackham stood beside him on the quarterdeck, one hand resting lightly on the railing. "Maybe they're not guarding it because they don't expect anyone to find it." Vane, leaning against the mast with restless impatience, snorted. "Or maybe they're hiding in those trees, waiting to shoot the first idiot who rows ashore." No one answered him, but every man on deck felt the truth of his words. The island's silence wasn't peaceful, felt like held breath. The three ships anchored at a cautious distance, sails trimmed and guns ready but not yet run out. The sea around them was deceptively calm, sunlight flickering across its surface as if nothing could possibly be lurking beneath. "We go in light," Hornigold said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "2 boats per ship. Only who's needed." Rackham nodded. "No loud movements, no torches, no flags. If the Spanish are here, we observe first." Vane folded his arms, jaw tensing. "And if we don't see anything?" Hornigold looked at him. "Then we look harder." The crews prepared silently. Pistols were primed. Cutlasses slid into worn belts. Powder horns were checked twice. The sound of oars being lowered over the rail echoed softly across the calm water. And Bonnie insisted on joining Rackham's boat. He didn't argue. He'd learned this was useless. Instead, he just gave her a long look that said everything he didn't say aloud. "Don't start frettin'," she told him with a quick smirk. "If we get shot, I'll make sure to fall on you." The boat crews pushed off, oars dipping quietly into the sea. As they neared the island, details sharpened. The harsh texture of the sand, the jagged rocks jutting like broken teeth, the way the trees leaned as though shaped by constant wind. But there was no wind now. The air hung strangely still, warm and thick. Rackham whispered, "Odd place for a Spanish supply stop." Hornigold nodded from the next boat over. "All the better to hide something." Their boats scraped ashore with a soft hiss. The moment the pirates stepped onto the sand, they froze instinctively, listening. Nothing. Not the creak of branches. Not the cry of birds. Not even insects. The island felt emptied. Blackbeard, who had joined Hornigold's boat without speaking a word, knelt and pressed his fingertips into the sand. He lifted them, letting grains slip away slowly. "Tracks," he said quietly. The others leaned in. Faint impressions, nearly erased by wind and time. Barely visible. but unmistakably human. Hornigold followed the line with his eyes. A landing party came recently, maybe days ago. Vane crouched down beside him. But no fire pits, no patrol path, nothing left behind. Unless, and Bonnie said softly, eyes narrowing toward the tree line, they didn't stay long. Something about the way she said it made the others fall silent. The pirates moved toward the trees, spacing out while keeping each other in sight. They stepped lightly, every footfall measured. Leaves crunched beneath their boots, dry, brittle, untouched for longer than expected. Halfway up the narrow rise toward the center of the island, Rackham paused. "Do you smell that?" he murmured. Hornigold inhaled. Gunpowder. Fresh. Before anyone spoke again, a sudden metallic glint flashed ahead. Every pirate froze. Blackbeard raised a hand silently, signaling the others to drop low behind the rocks. They obeyed instantly. They watched. A figure stepped into view. A Spanish soldier, uniform sun-bleached, rifle slung over his shoulder, walked a slow path across a clearing, scanning the brush methodically. He didn't look relaxed. He looked exhausted, wary, tense. His boots dragged slightly in the dust. Another soldier followed him moments later. Then a third. Hidden camp. Rackham exhaled a slow breath. Well, looks like the Spanish are home. But something was wrong. Hornigold narrowed his eyes. Look at their boots. Everyone looked. The soldiers' boots were caked with dried salt, up to the knees. Not from wading through shallow surf. From slogging through something deeper. Harder, Rackham whispered. They marched through water. Blackbeard shook his head. Not water. Marsh. Vane grinned darkly. Means they came in from the far side of the island. Not the beach. Or, Hornigold murmured, they abandoned something heavy in the marsh. The possibility hung in the air like a spark. Treasure hidden inland, not near the shore. But the mystery deepened as they kept watching. The soldiers weren't guarding treasure. They were guarding fear. Their heads snapped at every sound. Their fingers twitched near their triggers. They whispered to each other with the urgency of men expecting attack at any moment. These weren't relaxed troops stationed at a quiet outpost. These were men on alert. And Bonnie leaned close to Rackham, voice low as a breath. If they're this jumpy, someone's either hunting them, or they're guarding something they don't understand. Hornigold's gaze hardened. We need to see the rest. They tracked the soldiers from a distance, circling wide around the clearing. The forest grew thicker, shadows darker. The scent of gunpowder only increased. Then they saw it. A Spanish camp, small but fortified. Tents arranged in a rough circle, crates stacked haphazardly, a flagpole standing crookedly as if erected in haste. A cook fire burned low in a shallow pit. But there was something else. At the center of the camp, half covered with canvas, sat a large iron-bound chest. So massive it took 2 soldiers to shift it slightly while another barked commands. Rackham's breath caught. Vane's eyes widened like a man seeing the inside of a church for the first time. Even Blackbeard's stance changed, muscles tightening subtly. Hornigold exhaled. God above, that's no supply chest. And Bonnie's voice was barely a whisper. They're hiding treasure. But the scene didn't feel triumphant. Felt uneasy. The soldiers didn't look proud or protective. They looked terrified of what they were guarding. Rackham murmured, "Whatever's in that chest, they don't want it opened." Hornigold finished the thought quietly. Or they're afraid someone already tried. The wind finally stirred. A small, strange breath, rustling the canvas enough for a corner to lift. Just enough for the pirates to see a glimpse of what lay inside. A glint of gold, seal, and something else, something not metal. Something that made Hornigold's face pale. For a long moment no one spoke. Even the forest seemed to lean inward, as if it too were trying to understand what they had just seen beneath that lifted flap of canvas. The gold shimmered unmistakably. Coins, maybe a cup, maybe more. But it wasn't the treasure that froze every pirate in place. It was the object lying beside it. Smooth, bill, curved in ways that didn't belong to chests or armor or any crafted thing. Not round like a bowl. Not square like a plate. No carvings. No metal. Just bone. A single, unmistakable fragment of a human skull. And Bonnie pressed a hand quietly against Rackham's arm. He glanced at her, his face unusually still, and she whispered, "Why in God's name would they bury a skull with their gold?" Blackbeard didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the chest, on the uneasy sway of the canvas as the wind teased it, as if showing them too much by accident. His jaw worked slightly, and those nearest to him could sense it. He did not like this. Hornigold took a slow breath, grounding himself. The Spanish don't treat the dead this way. If a man dies with treasure, they bury him properly. They don't toss skulls into chests like they're ballast. Vane leaned forward, squinting. Unless it ain't Spanish. Maybe they found it already buried. Maybe they don't know what else to do with it. One of the soldiers shouted something sharp, and another hurried over, pulling the canvas down hard, almost fearfully, like he didn't want the sun to touch what lay inside. Rackham frowned. They're not protecting treasure. They're hiding it. No, Hornigold muttered quietly. They're containing it. A ripple of unease passed through the pirates. For men who lived by plunder, treasure was simple. Gold was gold. Loot was loot. But this, the nervous soldiers, the hasty camp, the skull mingling with riches, it felt wrong. Ancient somehow. Like something left behind by people who knew more about danger than the pirates ever would. Blackbeard finally spoke, voice low as gravel. They found something they weren't meant to. Hornigold agreed. And the Spanish want it off this island before someone else finds out. Vane cracked his knuckles, irritation overtaking fear. Then why the hell are they sittin' here instead of movin' it? Because, and said softly, eyes scanning the disturbed vegetation behind the tents, they've been slowed down. Everyone followed her gaze. A patch of ground at the far end of the camp was churned up, dirt thrown aside, roots torn. Not like digging, more like dragging. Something or someone had been pulled violently through the brush. A soldier limped nearby. His calf wrapped in a tight bandage, skin stained dark with dried blood. Rackham whispered, "What happened here?" Before anyone could speculate, Hornigold motioned them backward. The pirates retreated into the tree-line as silently as shadows. Once hidden, they huddled close. Hornigold's voice was barely audible. "This isn't a simple raid anymore. There's more at play than coin." Blackbeard nodded, but his eyes were elsewhere, staring past the camp to the dark stretch of mangrove beyond. "There's an old story," he muttered, "about islands like this. Places the Spanish mark on maps with no names. Only warnings." And raised a brow. "Warnings of what?" "Of where they bury the things they don't want found." Vane snorted softly. "You're startin' to sound like an old sea witch teach." But Blackbeard didn't fight him. "I've seen enough to know men fear strange things. Even brave men. And those soldiers." He paused, glancing again at the trembling canvas. "They're afraid of what's inside that chest." Rackham rubbed the back of his neck. "If they fear it, should we?" "Doesn't matter," Vane said sharply. "Treasure's treasure." "No," Hornigold cut in, tone hard. "This treasure comes with death tied to it. The skull wasn't there by accident." The group went silent. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint murmur of Spanish voices. They were arguing, desperate, hushed, tense. The pirates listened. No one understood the exact words, but the tone was clear. The soldiers were preparing to move soon. They were on edge, glancing toward the marsh path repeatedly, as if expecting someone or something to return. Rackham whispered, "We can't attack now. Not without understandin' what we're tuckin'," and nodded. "Then we watch. We wait. And when they move it, we follow." Hornigold hesitated. "But we do not open that chest until we're far from this place." Vane rolled his eyes. "What, scared of ghosts now?" Hornigold met his gaze, unflinching. I'm scared of men who think they can bury their fear but carry it anyway. That chest has weight beyond gold, Vane. You feel it, you just won't say it. Blackbeard finally put a hand on Vane's shoulder. Calm, steady, but firm. Listen to him. Vane exhaled sharply but didn't argue further. As the sun started its slow descent, the forest darkened. The soldiers grew more restless. They loaded muskets, strapped on gear, secured the chest with thick ropes. Their movements were jerky, hurried. Then one soldier, clearly an officer, stepped away from the camp and knelt on the forest floor, whispering a prayer. His voice trembled. His hand shook. When he rose, he crossed himself twice. And swallowed. They aren't just scared. They're terrified. The others nodded. As the soldiers prepared torches, Hornigold shifted his stance. We split. 2 groups. One stays here and tracks them quietly. One circles wider, in case the Spanish lead us into a trap. Rackham asked. And who approaches the chest first? Hornigold answered without hesitation. No one. Not yet. But Blackbeard's gaze drifted once more toward the mangrove, the place where the earth was torn up, the place where something had dragged itself or been dragged away. Something else is here, he murmured. And whatever left that mark, it ain't far. Cold hush fell over the pirates. Not from fear of the Spanish. From the island itself. From the sense that the chest wasn't the only thing buried here. That the skull wasn't the only warning. That something older, darker, waited beneath the surface. And as night pulled its shadow over the island, the pirates realized they were no longer hunters following the Spanish. They were stepping into something the Spanish wanted to escape. Night crept over the island like something alive, slow, deliberate, pressing its weight onto every branch and stone. The Spanish soldiers lit their torches, but the flames looked small, almost weak, as though the darkness swallowed more light than fire could give. From the tree-line the pirates watched. Blackbeard crouched low, his massive frame motionless as carved obsidian. Beside him, Anne Bonny's eyes stayed fixed on the chest. She wasn't watching the gold, she was watching the skull. She couldn't unsee it. Its blank curve had burrowed deep into her thoughts, like it belonged to the island more than any man. Look, she whispered. The soldiers were moving. 2 men lifted the chest with difficulty, grunting through clenched teeth. Not because of weight. Blackbeard could carry more coin than that on his back for sport. No, this struggle was different. They handled it like it pained them. Like the chest resisted. Rackham leaned closer. Why do they look like it stings them to touch it? Hornigold's face was grim. Because some things take more than flesh when you lift them. Vane rolled his eyes, about to make a snide remark, but then he fell silent. One soldier staggered under the chest's corner, his hands jerking open as if burned. He cursed, shaking his fingers violently. Another man rushed in to replace him, crossing himself as he grabbed the rope handles. No pirate spoke after that. Not even Vane. The officer barked an order. The soldiers formed a tight cluster around the chest, torches raised high, muskets primed. The camp dissolved in hurried movements. Tents collapsed, supplies abandoned. They weren't packing to travel. They were fleeing. And not from the pirates. Blackbeard nodded once. We follow him. Quiet. Spread out. Hornigold jabbed 2 fingers to his eyes, then toward the marsh where the dragging marks disappeared. That's our flank route. Rackham, and you're with me. Vane with Teach. Vane grimaced at taking orders but didn't resist. Even he could feel it now. The island's breath, slow and ancient, pushing through the mangroves. The 2 groups split silently. Blackbeard and Vane ghosted behind the soldiers, staying just beyond torchlight. Hornigold's group curved wide along the mangrove's edge, stepping over gnarled roots that rose from the earth like bones. Minutes passed, thick and heavy. Then the first sound reached them. Not a bird, not wind, not boots. A wet sound, a dragging sound, and froze mid-step. Rackham almost collided with her before he saw her face. Pale, rigid, eyes locked on the mud ahead. The trail they followed, the one dragged thing dragged violently, was fresher now. Patches of disturbed soil glistened with moisture that wasn't just water. Something had bled here. Hornigold knelt, touched 2 fingers to the dark streak, and exhaled sharply. "This blood ain't from a man." Rackham swallowed. "How can you even tell?" "Because," Hornigold whispered, "it's cold," and leaned down. He was right. The night was warm. But the blood, if it was blood, was cold as stone. A branch snapped behind them. Not from the soldiers' direction. Not from Blackbeard's trail. From deeper within the mangrove. All 3 spun toward the sound. But there was no movement. No figure. Just black water pooled around exposed roots. Still as a held breath. Hornigold motioned sharply. "We keep moving." But slower now, steps drawn out, senses stretched thin. The soldiers ahead were making more noise now. Shouting in harsh whispers, boots splashing through shallow water, the chest clanking faintly. Then Blackbeard's low signal whistled through the trees. Hornigold held up a hand, stopping his group instantly. All 3 eased forward until they could rejoin the other pirates. They found Blackbeard and Vane crouched at the edge of a clearing, faces lit by the flicker of distant torchlight. The Spanish had stopped. The chest sat on the ground. The officers argued violently, gesturing back toward the forest, and toward the mangrove. "They're scared of what's behind him," Vane whispered. "No," Blackbeard said quietly. "They're scared of what's below him." A soldier's torch flickered dangerously low. He lifted it, tapping the wood to reignite the flame. Something answered the tap from beneath the soil. Faint knock. The pirate group stiffened as one. The soldier froze. His eyes widened. He took a shaky step back. Another knock. Low. Hollow. Like knuckles on an empty chest. But it was coming from under the ground. Vane's voice was barely a breath. What the hell was that? Blackbeard didn't blink. Something warning them to leave. The soldiers panicked. 2 dropped their gear entirely. The officer shouted furiously, but even he trembled, pointing frantically toward the jungle path ahead. They lifted the chest again, and the ground where it had rested sagged slightly, like something beneath it had been pushing upward, and grabbed Blackbeard's arm. "This island doesn't want that chest moved." "No," he murmured. "It doesn't want it opened." As the soldiers fled into the trees, one man at the rear glanced back, and saw something the pirates couldn't. His face drained of blood. His torch slipped from his grasp and hissed out in the mud. He broke from the group entirely, running in the opposite direction, straight toward the mangrove. "Idiot!" Vane muttered. But then the man screamed. Not a short cry. A long, ripping scream that seemed pulled from the deepest part of his lungs, as if something was dragging the sound out of him. The pirates tensed. The scream cut off abruptly. Not faded. Not choked. Clean. And covered her mouth, horrified. Rackham whispered, "We shouldn't be here." Hornigold answered, "Then neither should the Spanish." Blackbeard stood slowly. "We follow the chest. Whatever's hunting them. It's tied to it." The forest seemed to listen. The knocking beneath the earth stopped. The air shifted like an exhale, like something settling back into the soil, waiting. As the pirates slipped after the fleeing soldiers, and looked once more toward the mangrove, toward the place where the scream had ended, the water there was still. Too still. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the skull in the chest hadn't been a warning because of what it was, but because of what was missing from it. Something that might still be out here. Something watching. The forest swallowed the last echoes of the soldier's scream as if it had been hungry for it. The pirates moved low and silent, sliding through the brush behind the retreating Spaniards. Torches flickered ahead. Jerky, frantic movements giving away the soldiers' fear more than their light guided them. Blackbeard raised a hand. Everyone stopped. The faint crunch of roots under Spanish boots drifted toward them, uneven and chaotic. "They're losin' formation," Rackham whispered. "They're losin' their minds," Vane answered. But Hornigold shook his head. Fear don't break a man's mind unless something real is chasing him, and swallowed softly. We heard it. Blackbeard nodded once. And they heard more. The soldiers hurried deeper into the marsh path, their torches forming a trembling orange line ahead. The chest swung between 4 of them, each man gripping the ropes so tightly their knuckles looked white even at a distance. They moved like they expected the ground to give way beneath them, like they feared whatever had knocked back from the soil would rise up. The pirates kept their distance, weaving through mud and mangrove roots. The night air hung thick with moisture, heavy enough that each breath felt like drawing in warm, wet cloth. Insects buzzed in distant waves, but the immediate forest around them was unervingly quiet, like everything was holding its breath. And stepped around a knot of roots, but her boots slipped slightly. Hornigold steadied her, whispering, "Careful! Marsh plays tricks." She nodded, but her eyes drifted toward the tree-line. She felt watched, not from the soldiers, from something older. The group pressed on. After another stretch of silence, the sound of splashing reached them, the soldiers entering water. The pirates slowed and peered through the trees into a clearing. The Spaniards stood ankle-deep in a dark tidal pool. Thick mangrove limbs arched overhead, forming natural arches like the ribs of a giant beast. The moonlight filtered in weak shards, reflecting off the black water. "What are they doing?" Rackham whispered. "Trying to cross it," Hornigold murmured. "Those pools lead toward the far side of the island. Might be heading to a rendezvous." Blackbeard crouched slowly. "Or they're following orders they don't agree with," and studied the soldiers' faces. Every man looked to the shadows, not the path. They were afraid of what followed them. But the water didn't comfort them either. Then one soldier, thin with a torn sleeve, stepped into the pool too quickly. His foot sank deeper than expected, and he cried out. Another soldier grabbed his arm, yanking him sideways. Mud churned upward, and the 2 men nearly toppled over. Vane snorted. "Idiots don't know how to wade." "Quiet," Blackbeard warned. The mud started to bubble. Anne's breath caught. "Do you see that?" she whispered. The water wasn't moving naturally. Pulsed. A single ripple flowed outward, then stopped as if the pool was alive and listening. The officer barked a command, but his voice cracked. He gestured hard, ordering the men to lift the chest higher as they crossed the pool. They obeyed, struggling in waist-deep water. Rackham frowned. "They're scared to get it wet." Hornigold's eyes narrowed. "No, they're scared of what happens if it sinks." Something brushed against Anne's boot. She jerked her leg up, and saw nothing but a coil of mangrove root. But it hadn't felt like a root. Had felt like fingers. Blackbeard leaned close, his whisper barely audible. "Something in that water ain't mud." Before Anne could answer, one of the soldiers screamed. A violent splash erupted as he was yanked under the water up to his shoulders. He flailed wildly, thrashing at whatever held him, his torch spinning into the dark. The others dropped the chest, splashing toward him in panic. Vane whispered, "Hell's teeth!" The soldier shrieked, "Sualtame, poor favor!" But the words drowned as he was dragged lower, his arms scraping desperately at the surface. 2 men grabbed him under the armpits and pulled, but something beneath the water pulled harder. The soldier's face twisted with terror, mud streaking down his jaw. His fingernails clawed into his comrade's sleeves, ripping cloth. The water churned violently. He was pulled under completely. Silence. The soldiers froze, staring at the pool in horror. No bubbles rose. No body surfaced. The water smoothed itself unnaturally fast, as if the pool were erasing the evidence of struggle. Rackham whispered, voice trembling, "What the hell took him?" Hornigold shook his head slowly. "Not an animal. An animal drags by limb or throat. That was like it grabbed his whole body." And shivered. She couldn't stop staring at the water where he disappeared. The pool looked deeper now. Darker. Hungrier. The soldiers made a desperate choice. They lifted the chest again and pushed forward, moving faster, abandoning torches that sputtered in the wet. The pirates stayed hidden, none daring to step closer to the water's edge. Blackbeard finally whispered, "We don't go through the pool." Vane made a small scoffing sound but didn't argue. The night air around the pool felt colder than the rest of the island, as if the water itself exhaled a chill. Hornigold pointed toward a narrow strip of higher ground skirting the pool's edge. "We take the ridge. Stay above the mud." The group moved carefully, following the curve of the pool. Every splash from the soldiers echoed like a hammer in the dark, but the pirates stepped lightly, not daring to disturb the soil below them. As they climbed the small rise, and cast one last glance at the water, something glinted beneath the surface. Round, bill, the size of a fist. A skull fragment, not the same one from the chest. Another. She felt her skin tighten. Something about the curve, something about its alignment in the water, felt wrong. It wasn't lying flat. It was looking upward. She tore her gaze away and hurried after the others. Ahead, the soldiers splashed out of the pool and continued along a narrow path leading deeper into the island. The chest swung heavily between them, water dripping from its base. Blackbeard motioned his crew to keep distance. "Whatever follows them, keeps to the wet." Hornigold nodded. "And whatever's in that chest wakes it." The forest thickened again as they moved forward, branches slicing narrow beams of moonlight into shifting patterns of shadow. The air grew warmer, almost stifling compared to the chill of the pool, and exhaled shakily. "Did you feel that water? Like it breathed around us?" Blackbeard answered softly, "Aye. And like it remembered what it's taken." The group pressed on, following the Spaniards deeper into the island's heart. The chest was ahead. The soldiers were weakening, and the island was waking. The deeper they moved inland, the more the forest seemed to fold around them. The branches hung lower. The air pressed thicker. The roots twisted tighter beneath their feet, as though the island was shaping itself deliberately, guiding them or trapping them. The Spaniards ahead grew more frantic. Their torches flickered wildly, smoke curling against leaves thick with humidity. They shouted quietly to each other, their voices trembling in ragged bursts. The chest bounced between them with every hurried step. Hornigold's group followed at a distance, navigating along a narrow ridge that overlooked the soldiers. It wasn't a high ridge, just a rise in the earth, but it offered enough ground to avoid the soggy marshland below. And watched every movement carefully, her senses heightened. "They're not headin' toward the beach," she whispered. "They're pushin' deeper. Look at the direction." Hornigold nodded, jaw tight. "They're not runnin'. They're followin' orders." Rackham frowned. "Orders to run toward danger instead of away from it. Spaniards are fools, but they're not usually this kind of fool." Blackbeard, silent until now, murmured, "It's not up to them. They're carryin' something someone else wants." Vane scoffed, but the edge in his eyes betrayed uncertainty. "Something wants that chest. What a ghost writin' orders." Blackbeard didn't look at him. His attention stayed fixed on the soldiers, more specifically on the chest. "Look at them, Vane. They're scared of losing it. But they're more scared of opening it. Men don't act that way unless something has told them, very clearly, what happens if they don't obey." The group fell quiet. The forest whispered, the leaves swaying faintly though no wind stirred them. It was as if the trees breathed on their own. Ahead, the Spanish officer raised a hand, and the group halted abruptly. He scanned the path, then gestured sharply to two soldiers, sending them ahead to clear brush. The remaining men set the chest down with relief, rubbing their aching shoulders, and leaned forward slightly, watching the officer's face. "Look at his eyes," she breathed. Rackham squinted. "What about him?" "They're looking everywhere but down," she murmured. "He's afraid of the ground." Hornigold noticed it too. The officer's gaze flicked constantly from tree to tree, as if expecting something to step forward. His hands shook as he adjusted his sword belt. Sweat streamed down his temples. But he never once looked at the soil near his feet. Blackbeard whispered. "He thinks the island is listenin'." A faint rustling stirred behind them. Too light for a man, too slow for an animal. And spun, her breath catching. But the forest stood still. Me. Shadows layered on shadows. She turned back slowly, pulse racing. Below, the soldiers shifted nervously. One man knelt to adjust the ropes on the chest, and froze. A soft gasp slipped from his lips. The others stiffened. The kneeling soldier reached forward with trembling fingers, brushing dirt from a patch of disturbed soil. A circular shape emerged beneath his hand. Rackham whispered, "Is that?" Another skull fragment. It lay half-buried, tilted as if it had been placed there intentionally. The bone was cracked, weathered, but unmistakably human. The soldier recoiled, crossing himself rapidly. The officer barked something angrily, but the fear in his own voice betrayed him. Vane muttered under his breath, "This island's a graveyard." Hornigold's tone was grim. Graveyards don't rearrange themselves. The two soldiers sent forward returned, waving urgently. They had cleared a path ahead, a narrow corridor of trampled brush leading toward a dense thicket of palm and mangrove. The officer motioned for the men with the chest to lift it again. But one soldier hesitated. He stared at the skull fragment. His face paled. His knees trembled. He muttered in Spanish, too softly to catch the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading. The officer snapped at him, shoving his shoulder. The man refused, and whispered, "He's not movin' that." Blackbeard nodded. "He knows something the others don't." The officer struck the soldier across the face with the flat of his sword. The crack echoed through the forest like a shot. The soldier stumbled back, but still didn't approach the chest. He pointed toward the mangroves, toward the darkness beyond, toward the pool they had escaped. And then he pointed to the earth beneath his own boots. Vane translated quietly. "He's sayin' the ground ain't safe. That something's under it." Hornigold exhaled slowly. "He's right." The officer, desperate to keep control, seized the man's wrist and dragged him forward. The soldier struggled, his boots scraping leaves. A tremor passed through the earth. Tuttle. Like a shudder beneath the soil. Anne's breath hitched. "You felt that?" Rackham nodded slowly. "Like the ground's alive." Another shift. Light. But unmistakable. The Spaniards panicked instantly, several stumbling backward. The officer shouted, shoving men into position. They lifted the chest again, nearly dropping it in their rush. The pirates froze, each instinct screaming to retreat, but none moved. Blackbeard's voice was a faint rumble. "Something under this island ain't content to stay buried." As the Spaniards pushed forward, the soldier who resisted broke free and sprinted into the trees, straight toward the ridge where the pirates waited, and held her breath. If he reached them, if he screamed, the whole group would be exposed. He crashed through the brush. His eyes were wide, wild, full of tears. He wasn't looking for help. He was fleeing blindly. Hornigold raised a hand to signal silence, urging everyone to stay hidden. The soldier was nearly upon them. He tripped. His foot caught on something in the soil. He hit the ground hard, face first, and scrambled upright with a strangled cry, and leaned forward. His foot wasn't caught on a root. It was caught on a hand. Human hand. Not flesh. Bone. It protruded from the earth, thin, pale, and curled around his ankle like it had been waiting. Anne pressed her fist to her mouth. Rackham whispered, voice cracking, "No!" The soldier tore himself free, ripping skin from his ankle as he staggered away. But before he could get far, the soil beside the exposed bones heaved, shifted, and something began to rise. The pirates didn't breathe. The Spaniards didn't notice. They were too busy dragging the chest toward the thicket. Blackbeard stared at the ground, eyes dark and unblinking. "Not bones," he murmured. "Remains." The earth split wider. And something ancient, something human-shaped but impossibly wrong, pushed upward through the soil. The shape pushed higher, soil cascading off its frame in thin whispering streams. It wasn't like a living man climbing upward. It was too slow, too deliberate, as though the island itself was guiding it, lifting it, revealing what should never have been uncovered. The rising figure straightened, vertebra by vertebra, its spine clicking faintly like distant shells tapping together. A skull emerged last, pale and long-weathered, its jaw unhinged slightly as if frozen mid-scream. But it wasn't the bones that made the pirate's breath falter. It was the posture. The thing stood upright, balanced. Where? Anne's hand closed around her dagger, though she knew a blade meant nothing to something that had already died. Rackham pressed against the trunk of a tree, eyes wide, every bit of tension in his body pulling him away from the sight. The soldier who had tripped staggered backward, shaking violently, breath stuttering. He tried to lift himself, but his legs wouldn't obey. The skeletal figure turned its head toward him, the motion impossibly smooth for something without flesh. Blackbeard exhaled, the sound low and tight. "That ain't a ghost." Hornigold's whisper was barely audible. "It's an old burial," disturbed, and something woke with it. Vane murmured something under his breath that sounded dangerously close to a prayer. The skeleton took one staggered step toward the wounded soldier. Dry earth fell from the hollow sockets like tears. The Spaniard finally managed to crawl, scrambling away on hands and elbows, but he was too slow. His ankle still bled. His breath hitched. His voice cracked as he cried out for help that wouldn't come. Another tremor rippled through the ground. But this one didn't come from beneath. Came from around. Anne's eyes snapped to the left. Another patch of soil lifted. Then another. Then another. Small mounds rising like breath pushing from below. Rackham choked out a whisper. "They're everywhere." Blackbeard's grip tightened on his cutlass, though he didn't draw it. He knew the sound of steel would give away their position. The Spaniards ahead had finally noticed the soldiers' cries. They turned, torches wavering, faces going pale as they spotted him writhing on the forest floor. The officer shouted an order, and two men rushed toward him, muskets trembling in their hands. But they froze halfway, because now the earth was shifting not just at the soldiers' feet, but across the entire clearing. Dozens of small humps rose like shallow graves breathing open. Dry roots snapped. Fingers, skeletal, dirt-stained, broke through the soil, and swallowed hard. "This isn't natural," she whispered. Hornigold shook his head. "No burial ground behaves like this. These bodies ain't been here long enough to move like that." Blackbeard exhaled through his teeth. "And yet they're getting up." More skeletal forms pushed free. Some whole, some broken, some missing limbs but still crawling upward as if drawn toward the wounded soldier. The officer screamed for his men to retreat. The soldier on the ground sobbed, kicking weakly, blood smearing the dirt. One of the skeletons reached him. Its bony hand pressed against his chest, not clawing, holding, pinning him down with impossible force. The soldier's scream echoed through the trees, scattering birds in a furious burst. Even the other Spaniards stumbled, dropping the chest in terror. The thud of the wooden box hitting the soil made the skeletons flinch, every skull turning toward it in eerie unison, as if the sound had meaning. Rackham stiffened. They heard the chest. "No!" Anne whispered, her voice trembling. "They recognized it." The officer grabbed one of the torches and swung it wildly at the nearest skeleton, shouting. The flame licked bone. The skeleton reeled back but didn't burn. Instead, the soot streaked across its skull like war paint. Hornigold leaned close to the others. "These aren't spirits. Their bodies left behind, protectors maybe. Bound to whatever's in that chest." Blackbeard nodded slightly. "Makes sense. Spaniards dug something up they shouldn't have. Something buried with a warning." The clearing erupted into chaos. The Spaniards fled, abandoning weapons, abandoning the chest, abandoning the screaming soldier pinned under skeletal hands. One tripped on a root and fell hard, scrambling desperately as two skeletal forms crawled toward him with jerky, unnatural speed. Vane muttered, "This is cursed land. All of it," and didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the chest, the rope handles still taut from where the men had dropped it mid-run. It sat tilted, one corner sinking into the soft earth, the canvas partially torn open from the fall. Something inside the chest slid. A dull metallic shift, like a chain, like a latch, like something being gently moved, not by the fall but from within, and grabbed Blackbeard's arm. It moved. He stared at the chest, his jaw clenched. I saw it." Rackham turned sharply, panic rising in his voice. "We need to leave now. This ain't gold worth tucking." Hornigold shook his head slowly. If the Spaniards were hauling it through this hell, someone higher than them wanted it moved, wanted it away from here. "And now it's sittin' in front of us," Vane growled softly. Screams tore through the clearing as one of the Spaniards was overtaken. Bones clattered like wind-snapped branches as the skeletons closed in on the fleeing group. The officer, realizing escape toward the marsh was impossible, veered toward the pirates' ridge, unknowingly running straight toward them. His face contorted in terror, his lips trembling as he muttered broken prayers. Hornigold motioned everyone back deeper into the foliage. The officer sprinted past the base of their ridge, unaware of their presence in the shadows. The sound of his footfalls faded quickly as he fled into the thicker forest beyond. But the skeletons didn't chase him. They all turned instead, slowly, in unison, toward the chest, and's breath shook. "They're guarding it," Blackbeard murmured. "Not guardin', respondin'." One of the skeletons reached the chest and placed its palm on the wood. The hand was small, perhaps once a child's. A crack ran down the lid where it touched, wood splitting like something inside was pushing outward. The skeleton recoiled violently, its entire body jerking back like it had touched fire. It collapsed into a heap of bones that clattered against the dirt. But the others didn't stop. More skeletal hands reached for the chest, trembling, hesitant, almost fearful. Each one that touched the lid spasmed, collapsing into dust and bone fragments. But still they reached. On. Compelled. Bound. Blackbeard's voice lowered into a haunted whisper. "Whatever's inside that chest, even the dead fear it." The chest trembled again. And this time, exhaled. A thin stream of cold air seeped through the crack, curling upward like frostbitten breath. Blackbeard whispered, "Get ready, because something ancient was waking." And now it knew it wasn't alone. And so, with the lantern light trembling against the warped wooden planks of the tavern wall, the uneasy quiet settled like a heavy cloth over every pirate in the room. What Anne had said, what she suggested, didn't vanish into the air. It stayed there, hanging thick, nearly visible. Some men stared into their cups, pretending not to hear. Others tightened their jaw or shifted in their seats, pretending they weren't thinking the exact same thing she dared to voice aloud. Because by this point, late 1718, the Republic of Pirates wasn't really a republic anymore. It was a flickering candle waiting for the slightest breath to put it out. New Providence had grown swollen with conflict, alliances bending under the weight of greed and fear. Compliments had turned into whispers, and cooperation had turned into secret calculations behind every pair of eyes. You could almost sense that Nassau itself was repositioning, silently tilting from a rowdy brotherhood of thieves into something darker. What happened next inside that smoky tavern was small. Just a few exchanged looks, a few quiet nods, but it was the kind of quiet moment that becomes louder with time. And Bonnie pushed her hair from her eyes and leaned closer to Mary Red, the way conspirators or old lovers might. Mary dipped her head, listening. Then Calico Jack Rackham, doing what he always did, following impulses that sounded clever only inside his own skull, leaned in too. The three of them together formed a crooked little triangle of trouble. Outside, Nassau buzzed like a restless creature, lanterns swinging, boots on dirt, shouted words from pirates who were too far into their rum to remember who was supposed to be their friend. Yet beneath all that noise lived a bare truth. The once united pirate haven was dividing into factions, each loyal to different visions of the future. Some still believed in Charles Vane's fire and blood approach. Others drifted toward Benjamin Hornigold's new caution, wary of provoking the entire British Empire. And some, like Jack Rackham, were trying to carve out their own path somewhere between ambition and vanity. Later that night, as the moon climbed higher above Nassau's half-ruined fortifications, Calico Jack slipped outside. The surf whispered in soft patterns along the shore, and the smell of salt mixed with the faraway reek of tar and gunpowder. He stood with his hands at his waist, staring at the anchored ships gently rocking. Each one held a crew whose loyalty lived in a strange balance. Fear, admiration, opportunity, desperation. It was never simple. Not here. Not among pirates, where loyalty lasted only until a better offer arrived. Behind him, Anne and Mary stepped out into the night, the tavern door thudding shut behind them, and rested her hand on the hilt of her cutlass, a habit she developed from the months of uncertainty. Mary crossed her arms and studied Jack's back the way a soldier studies the battlefield, identifying angles, risks, possibilities. Jack didn't turn when he spoke. "You two think Vane's finished?" and shrugged. "He's burning the island from the inside. If we stay with him, we'll burn too," Mary added. "And Hornigold, he's turning into a governor's pet. That doesn't leave much for the rest of us." Jack finally turned, face lit by moonlight, expression pulled tight by that familiar mixture of charm and worry. "So what do you suggest?" he asked, and smirked slightly. "Something new." It was vague, but in Nassau, vague ideas had a habit of becoming very real very fast. Not long after that short exchange, another change swept across the island. Word traveled quicker than ships, quicker than wind, because every pirate had an ear tuned to rumor. And the rumor this time was big. Edward Thatch, better known as Blackbeard, had returned to the area, not just passing through, positioning himself. His presence always meant a shift in balance, like a storm turning in the distance. Some pirates revered him, others feared him. Most simply tried not to anger him. Vane hated him. So when the whispers crawled through the taverns, Vane smashed a bottle against a post and ranted that Blackbeard was trying to overshadow him again. Hornigold raised his eyebrows and muttered that Thatch's return meant the British Crown would feel justified in sending even stronger forces. Jack Rackham, though, he saw something else. Opportunity. Adventure. Maybe even a chance to break away from the fading structure of Nassau's so-called republic. All these threads, the rising tensions, the returning legends, the crumbling alliances, wove together quietly, stitching a new pattern in the dark. Every pirate felt the shift, even if they didn't yet understand what direction the island was turning toward. And by dawn of the next day, things had changed again in a way none of them expected. Because a ship arrived on the horizon, one with unfamiliar sails, unfamiliar symbols, and a crew that didn't follow any of the existing factions. They weren't tied to Vane. They weren't followers of Hornigold. They weren't returning allies of Blackbeard. And they certainly weren't loyal to Jack Rackham. This ship came with its own purpose. A purpose no pirate in Nassau saw coming. That strange vessel cutting slowly across the morning light carried no familiar reputation, no rumor trailing behind it, no whispered warning shared in candlelit corners. Its sails were a pale, weather-beaten gray, stitched with symbols that didn't belong to any pirate banner. Even the gulls circling above seemed uneasy, drifting wide around the mast as though the air around it were different. By the time the ship eased toward Nassau's harbor, a quiet crowd had already formed along the shore. Pirates didn't usually gather quietly. Rowdy noise was their language, but this was the exception. Uncertainty had a way of muting even the loudest men. Mary Red was one of the first to step forward, studying the vessel with the sharp, disciplined gaze she'd carried long before she ever set foot on a pirate deck. And Bonnie stood just behind her, leaning slightly as she whispered, "That's no merchant ship. Look at the draft, she's built for speed. Jack Rackham squinted, shading his eyes with his hand. And secrecy, he added. Look at the paint, matte, not glossy. Someone designed her to disappear at a distance. Then the anchor splashed, the ropes tightened, and the unfamiliar crew began to appear over the rails. Faces hardened by travel, features sunburned and scarred, clothing clean enough to show discipline but worn enough to show they weren't Navy men. And their leader, a tall figure with a dark coat that flapped heavily in the wind, stepped onto the deck with slow, deliberate confidence. He didn't shout orders. He didn't gesture grandly. He simply stood there, letting the pirates of Nassau study him the way wolves study another wolf approaching their territory. Whispers broke out immediately. Privateers. No, Navy would raise flags. Mercenaries. Smugglers. Who comes here without fear? Mary's eyes narrowed. Something's off. They're too calm. As the stranger finally disembarked, his boots touched Nassau sand with a certainty that made nearby men step back instinctively. He carried no drawn weapon, but his presence was one of someone who'd had to fight often enough that the blade didn't need to be visible. Jack cleared his throat, a tempting charm. Welcome to Nassau, friend. Not a place strangers arrive lightly. The man lifted his eyes and spoke in a low, steady voice. I'm Captain Elias Crow, and I've come looking for a man you call Blackbeard. The reaction spread through the gathered pirates like a ripple in water. Some laughed nervously, some muttered under their breath, and others exchanged looks dripping with dread or fascination. Blackbeard. Even his name stirred something primal. Respect. Fear. Stories soaked in blood and smoke. And stepped forward, chin raised slightly. And what business do you have with Thatch? Crow held her gaze with unwavering calm. I intend to end him. A hush fell deeper, heavier. Not even the harbor wind moved for a moment. 'Cause no one said things like that out loud. Men threatened Blackbeard in their dreams, never in public. To claim you wanted to destroy him, especially right here in the heart of pirate rule, wasn't bravery. It was madness. Or confidence earned in a life that most men never survived. Mary folded her arms. You're either the bravest man to set foot here, or the most foolish. Crow's answer was simple. Doesn't matter which. I'll find him. With that, he walked past the gathering crowd, moving toward the center of Nassau as if he already knew the island's paths. Pirates parted instinctively around him, unsure whether to respect his audacity or fear it. Jack let out a long breath he'd been holding. Well, he muttered, that's one way to start trouble before breakfast. But and wasn't amused. If he's hunting Blackbeard, he won't be the only one to spill blood. This place is about to crack open. And she wasn't wrong. Because Crow's arrival lit a fuse that had been waiting far too long. Vane heard about it within the hour and raged so violently that half his crew avoided him. Hornigold took it as a sign that the British crackdown was overdue. Even the tavern keepers lowered their voices, sensing Nassau's fragile peace fracturing like dry wood. But the biggest reaction, the one that would shape everything that followed, came from the man Crow sought. Blackbeard. He was anchored not far from the island, brooding over new plans of his own, when a messenger rode out breathlessly to tell him, Captain, a man's come to Nassau. Says he's here to kill you. Blackbeard didn't shout. He didn't laugh. He simply leaned back, stroking his beard, embers drifting from the slow match cords woven into it. Is that so? He murmured. And the way he said it, quiet, thoughtful, was far, far more dangerous than fury. Out on the water, clouds gathered. Storm was coming. One neither Nassau nor the pirates of the Republic were prepared for. Blackbeard didn't move for a long moment after hearing the messenger's words. He sat in the creaking captain's chair of the Queen Anne's Revenge, the faint glow of fuses woven through his beard illuminating the dark cabin in slow, ember-bright pulses. Each flicker made the shadows jump along the walls like crouched creatures. The messenger, barefoot, trembling, hat clutched against his chest, waited in total silence. When Blackbeard finally spoke, his voice was calm. Come. Describe him. The messenger swallowed. Tall, long coat, dark hair tied back. Carries himself like someone who's used to command, sir. Not navy. Not pirate. He didn't brag, didn't ask for backup. Just walked into Nassau and said your name. Blackbeard leaned forward slightly. The ember light traveled across the scar under his eye, catching on the metal beads threaded through his beard. A hunter, then. The messenger nodded quickly. Aye, Captain. And not one whit afraid. Blackbeard smiled, not wide, not warm. Thin and sharp, the way a blade smiles. Good, he murmured. A man with no fear bleeds like any other. He rose, heavy boots thudding against the deck, and the messenger flinched as the towering figure passed him. Blackbeard didn't notice, or he didn't care. He pushed the cabin door open and strode onto the deck, where the sea wind caught the smoke drifting from his beard fuses, trailing it behind him like phantom tendrils. His quartermaster, Israel Hans, approached immediately. Trouble? Hans asked. Blackbeard stared out toward the faint smudge of Nassau across the horizon. A man's walked into my home and declared he means to end me. Hans blinked. A live man or dead one? Blackbeard's lip twitched. Alive. Which means he can be taught regret. Hans grimaced. Want the men ready? Blackbeard shook his head slowly. No, not yet. If he wanted subtlety, he'd have crept in with a blade. But he announced himself. He's invitin' me to play. And you're acceptin'. The moment he spoke my name. He turned to Hans, eyes glinting. Prepare the longboat. We sail for Nassau. Hans hesitated only once. Alone. Blackbeard gave him a look that settled the matter instantly. Alone. In Nassau, word of Captain Elias Crow's arrival had already rippled across the island with the speed of spilled rum on a hot plank. Taverns buzzed. Dice games paused. Men with scars older than some kingdoms leaned forward, murmuring, A man come to kill Thatch. Bold fool. About time someone tried. If Crow's mad enough to challenge the devil, he might just be mad enough to win. But the strangest reactions came from the women, and Bonnie and Mary Reed especially, who watched Crow from a distance as he made his slow, deliberate way through the settlement. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't recruiting allies. He wasn't drinking or gambling or boasting. He walked with the patience of someone who had already planned every move he intended to make, and murmured, He's not lookin' for Blackbeard. Mary nodded slightly. He's lurin' him. And you think Thatch won't see that? Oh, he'll see it, Mary said. Question is, will he care? And frowned. Thatch never turns down a challenge. That's what scares me. Across the makeshift marketplace, Crow moved through the crowd with a predator silence. Children stopped playing to stare at him. Dogs whimpered and ducked behind crates. Even the rowdiest men muttered quietly, as though something about him unsettled the air itself. Crow stopped at a weathered table where a map seller hunched over his dusty wares. Harbor layout, Crow said. Not loudly, but firmly. The map seller froze at the sound of his voice. Something about it seemed to vibrate under the skin, heavy with certainty. He spread out a tattered parchment. Crow examined it for only a moment before shaking his head. This is old. The man gulped. Sir, it's the best. Crow slid a coin across the table. Tell me where the Queen Anne's revenge anchors. The map seller blanched. Sir, that's Captain, that's suicide. Crow lifted his eyes slowly. The map seller's words died in his throat. Point, Crow said. A shaking finger traced the coastline. Crow studied the place for exactly one breath, then turned and walked away. No thanks, no threat. Just departure, as if he'd already acquired all he needed, and watched him disappear between two rows of shacks. She exhaled. He's not posturin'. He's not hypin' himself up. He's movin' like a man who won't be denied. Mary crossed her arms. Then this'll end bloody. Out on the water, Blackbeard's longboat sliced through the waves like a dark arrow. The oars cut quietly, rhythmically. No crew accompanied him. No show of force. Just Edward Thatch, the man whose name inspired fear from Virginia to the Spanish Main. But as he neared the harbor, he felt the shift. Pressure. Tension thick enough to taste. He grinned slightly. They already know. He stepped out as soon as the boat scraped the shallows, boots splashing through water and onto sand. The crowd parted before him. Not dramatically, not with gasps, but with the instinctive respect animals show a larger predator. Blackbeard walked through Nassau as though he owned every plank and stone. And waiting for him at the edge of the square, standing like a statue carved from resolve, was Captain Elias Crow. For a long moment neither man spoke. The crowd around them held its breath. Thatch's beard embers flickered. Crow's coat shifted quietly in the breeze. Two storms meeting. Two wolves locking eyes. Finally, Crow broke the silence. "I've waited a long time to meet you." Blackbeard tilted his head. "And now you have." Crow's voice did not rise. Did not waver. "Edward Thatch. I'm here to collect a debt." Blackbeard smiled slowly. "Then you'd best pray I remember owing you." The square tensed. Every man ready to run, fight, or hide. Crow's hand drifted toward his coat. Blackbeard rested his on the hilt of his cutlass. Thunder rumbled offshore. And Nassau, for one suspended heartbeat, stood at the edge of a war. The thunder rolled again. Closer this time, closer than any cloud in the sky should have allowed. A strange, heavy echo that seemed to vibrate through the sand beneath everyone's feet. But neither Blackbeard nor Captain Elias Crow looked away from each other. Two men in the center of Nassau, both standing still as carved mastheads. Everyone else, the gamblers, the fishmongers, the sailors, the brothel girls leaning from balconies, watched with a dread that grew by the second. Blackbeard broke the silence first. Voice low, almost conversational. "You say I owe you a debt." His hand tightened around the cutlass hilt. "But I've taken many things in my life. You'll need to be far more specific." Crow didn't blink. Didn't smile. Didn't offer theatrics like most men challenging a legend. He simply said, "You killed a man you never should have touched." That made even Blackbeard pause. Not out of guilt. He had none. But because of the strange calm behind the words. They didn't sound like vengeance for a father or brother. Not a friend. Not a crewmate. Something older. Deeper. Blackbeard studied him. "Name him." Crow shook his head. "No." The crowd murmured, unsure how to interpret that. Blackbeard's eye narrowed. "No. You don't deserve the name," Crow said quietly. "But you'll recognize the debt when I pay it." Blackbeard's jaw flexed. They stood not 10 paces apart, but it felt like the whole island lay between them. And Bonnie had drifted to the edge of the square with Mary Red, both hidden among crates and barrels, and leaned forward like a hawk perched on a bough. "This is different," she whispered. Mary nodded. Thatch is enjoyin' the attention, but Crow, he ain't doin' this for show." "No," Anne murmured. "He's doin' this because he truly believes he can take Blackbeard down." Mary's voice dropped. "Or because he's already seen something worse." A hush rippled through the crowd as Blackbeard took a step closer to Crow. The torches on the posts along the square seemed to bend inward, drawn toward the center. Blackbeard's voice fell to a dangerous murmur. "Tell me something, Captain Crow. Have we crossed paths before?" "No," Crow answered immediately. "That's so." Blackbeard's smile returned. Predatory, wolfish. "Then why speak to me like a man who stared me down once already?" Crow's right hand slipped fully inside his coat. Gasps broke out. Hands darted to weapons. But Crow didn't draw a pistol. He pulled out a small, leather-wrapped object. Worn. Edges frayed like it had been held too tightly for too many years. He opened the flap. And withdrew. A bone fragment. Human. Cleaned. Smoothed by age. But carved. Carved with strange markings that looked more scratched than written. symbols that made several men instinctively step back, as if the shapes themselves disturbed the eye. Blackbeard's expression shifted. Barely, but it shifted. A tightening at the corner of his eyes. A stiffening of his shoulders. A deepening of the lines around his mouth. He'd seen markings like that before. And saw it too and whispered sharply. "Bloody hell, he recognizes it." Crow held the bone piece where only Blackbeard could see it clearly. "This belonged to a man who followed you," Crow murmured. "Who trusted you. Beep. And who died because you opened something you should have left buried." Blackbeard's jaw clenched. The ember fuses woven into his beard crackled, casting a flare of light across his features. That flare illuminated something rare. Uncertainty. The crowd didn't understand the artifact, but they understood that expression. Hands drifted off weapons. Voices quieted. Feet shifted back as if giving space to a storm. Blackbeard spoke slowly. "You don't know what you're holding." "I know exactly what I'm holding," Crow replied. "And I know you brought death with you long before your ship ever touched Nassau's waters." Blackbeard's fists tightened. Then Crow stepped closer. Only a single pace, but it felt like he crossed a chasm. His voice dropped. "You didn't bury those bodies. They buried themselves." The square went silent. Completely silent. Even the gulls stopped calling. Blackbeard's pupils narrowed like a cornered animal's, but not with fear. With a fury that boiled just beneath the surface. He stepped forward until the two men stood only 5 paces apart. "You think you know what happened," Blackbeard said. "You think you know what I saw. What I fought. What I damned well stopped." Crow's reply was a whisper that slid under Blackbeard's ribs like a cold blade. "You didn't stop anything." Another rumble of thunder shook the air. Again with no rain, no storm, no cloud. This one was so deep that several men clutched the edges of barrels or doorframes. Mary Reed muttered, "That ain't thunder," and nodded slowly. "No, that's the earth." Crow slipped the bone fragment back into his coat with reverence, almost like a priest protecting a relic. He loosened his shoulders, and for the first time, he reached for his sword. Not quickly, not showily, just a simple motion, clarity embodied. Blackbeard mirrored him. Steel slid free. The entire square tensed. Crow spoke softly. Too softly for most to hear, but perfectly clear to the man facing him. "Your debt is due, Edward Thatch." Blackbeard stepped forward. "And I intend to collect my own." They moved at the same moment. 2 titans, blades drawn. And Nassau erupted around them. The Spaniards pulled farther into the darkness, forcing their torches ahead like they were trying to push the night itself away. The chest swung between them with each uneven step, ropes creaking, the wood groaning under the strain. But they didn't slow. Not even when the path narrowed to the width of a single man. Not even when branches scraped their faces and strange insects scuttled across their boots. The pirates followed silently, threading through the shadows along a higher ridge to the right, staying close enough to track every motion but far enough to vanish if the soldiers turned. And held her breath as she stepped over a fallen trunk, her fingers brushing bark that felt unervingly warm. "This place ain't right," she whispered. Rackham nodded, barely audible. "Feels like the trees are watchin'." "They are," Blackbeard muttered softly. "Just not with eyes." Ahead, the Spaniards reached a clearing. Small, round, unnaturally symmetrical. Too perfect for nature. The earth was flattened, cleared of stones and brush. In the center stood a post. Simple. Weathered. Tall enough to mark a place someone wanted remembered. At the sight of it, the soldiers' panic shifted into something worse. Resignation. The kind of dread a man feels when he finally reaches the place he least wanted to go. "Dear God," Hornigold breathed. The officer barked orders, voice cracking. The men lowered the chest beside the post. One crossed himself so frantically his fingers shook. Blackbeard leaned forward from the ridge, breath steady but shoulders tense. "This is no ordinary burying ground." Anne's eyes traced the circle of earth. "Someone cleared this place. Recently." Rackham crouched, squinting. Recently, or repeatedly. Look, there's layers. Like the ground's been dug up more than once. Hornigold's jaw set. Spanish rites don't do this. They bury once. A seal. They move on. Then what's it for? And whispered. Blackbeard answered quietly. For puttin' something back. Down below. The officer knelt beside the chest. He didn't touch it. He whispered to it. Prayer. Or a warning. Or maybe both. The remaining soldiers formed a loose defensive circle, muskets shaking in their hands. Then a sound drifted through the clearing. Soft at first. A low, almost tender hum. Like breath. Like something waking. Anne's hand froze on her pistol. Veins stiffened. What the hell was that? Before anyone could respond, the soil behind the post shifted, slowly, rolling like a wave under fabric. The movement was so subtle the Spaniards didn't see it at first. But the pirates did. The earth rose, then sank, then rose again. Rackham's whisper cracked with fear. It's under the ground. And swallowed hard. That soldier earlier, he tried to warn us. Hornigold lifted his cutlass though he hadn't moved an inch. There's something in that soil that shouldn't be. Blackbeard spoke barely above a breath. It's not the chest they fear. It's what comes to claim it. The Spaniards finally noticed the shifting dirt. Panic exploded instantly. 2 soldiers stumbled backward, nearly falling over each other. One dropped his musket entirely. The officer shouted at them to hold position, but his voice betrayed him. He was terrified too. The soil cracked. A thin fissure opened behind the post. The sound that escaped was worse than any roar. Quiet, wet, like earth sighing through teeth it shouldn't have. And flinched. God save us! Something pushed upward. Not fast. Not violent. Low. Like something confident, like something certain no one could stop it. A hand broke the surface first. Human-shaped, skeletal, but covered in something dark and tar-thick. Not flesh. Not mud. Something older. It gripped the earth. Pull. Another hand surfaced beside it. The Spaniards screamed and scattered, scrambling away from the post. One man ran blindly into a tree. Another dropped to his knees sobbing. The officer alone stayed on his feet, sword drawn, but shaking so hard he could barely lift it. The creature, whatever it was, began to rise. A head emerged. Human in shape, but wrong in every angle. The skull was elongated, cracked, bound by strips of ancient cloth fused into the bone itself. Empty sockets stared out like wells into darkness. Blackbeard whispered, "By the depths!" The rest of the body surfaced in pieces, shifting unnaturally, as if joints didn't belong where joints should be. Ribs jutted like claws. Spine twisted in ways no living thing could manage. And behind it, more movement, more fissures opening, more hands breaking the soil. "They ain't alone," Vane said, voice barely stable, and gripped her knife. "This is a burial site. But not for the dead." Hornigold finished grimly. For what refused to stay dead? The first figure straightened fully, towering, swaying, dripping with a thick black substance that clung to its bones like mourning clothes. It turned toward the chest, ignoring the soldiers entirely. Rackham whispered, "It wants the chest." The officer, desperate, raised his sword and stepped between the creature and the chest. His bravery lasted less than a heartbeat. The creature reached forward, its hand stretching in an impossible, bone-cracking motion, and touched the man's cheek. Just a touch. The officer froze. His eyes widened. Then his body collapsed inward. Silently, instantly, like every bone turned to dust at once. His clothes dropped into a heap, empty, and pressed a hand to her mouth, choking back a sound. Rackham staggered. Vane swore under his breath, voice shaking. Hornigold's lips barely moved. "We can't fight that." Below, the remaining Spaniards broke completely. They fled into the forest, abandoning the chest, abandoning their weapons, abandoning everything. One tripped and didn't rise. Another vanished between the trees with a scream that cut off too suddenly. The creature ignored them. It bent toward the chest. More skeletal figures emerged behind it now. 5, 6, maybe more, each dripping with the same black substance. They surrounded the chest like mourners at a grave. Blackbeard's voice was low, hollow. "It ain't treasure. It's a seal." And swallowed throat tight. A seal for what? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the largest creature, the one that had risen first, reached down, placed its palm gently on the lid of the chest, and the wood began to rot beneath its touch. Not burn. Not crack. But instantly, aggressively, like time itself was collapsing around it. The lid sagged inward. The ropes snapped. The chest gave way with a soft, rotten sigh. And something inside shifted. Not gold. Not metal. Something wrapped. Something pulsing. Something alive. Anne's eyes widened in horror. Rackham stumbled back. Vane stopped breathing. Even Hornigold's composure cracked. And Blackbeard whispered, barely audible, "God help us!" Because whatever the Spaniards tried to bury was waking. Fear had a strange way of traveling through Nassau. It didn't arrive like a storm or a gunshot. Seep. Quiet, invisible, slow, but unmistakable. One whisper became 5. 5 became 50. And by the end of that uneasy week, even men who pretended to laugh about Roger's approach were sleeping with half their weapons still strapped to their belts. Yet in that tense atmosphere, another kind of pressure grew. One that wasn't born from fear of outside threats, but from human nature itself. The flying gang had always operated like a loose family, but a family made of men who thrived on autonomy, impulse, and personal pride. Roger's looming arrival amplified every simmering disagreement. Old grievances resurfaced. Rivalries sharpened. Captains who had tolerated each other out of mutual benefit now eyed one another like threats. In those days, the taverns became the battlegrounds. Not with blades, but with words. It started with a heated argument between Charles Vane and a crewman who had served under Benjamin Hornigold years earlier. Drinks spilled. Chairs scraped. Men scrambled back, ready to duck if pistols were drawn. Hornigold's old supporter accused Vane of leading too many reckless raids, jeopardizing Nassau's stability for the thrill of a burning ship. Vane, half drunk but still dangerously aware, didn't shout. He simply leaned in, smiled thinly, and said one line that chilled the entire room. "If you want a safe life, find another island." No fight broke out, but the message spread instantly. Vane would not bend. Not now, not ever. Blackbeard, on the other hand, stepped back from the chaos. He spent those days walking the shoreline at dawn, speaking quietly with his quartermasters, studying the horizon as if it would tell him the outcome of decisions not yet made. His crew respected his silence. They could sense he was calculating something larger than fear, something strategic. Edward Teach had never been the kind of man who let events simply happen to him. He shaped situations. He anticipated turns before others recognized them. Meanwhile, Calico Jack took the opposite approach. He entertained. He flirted. He told exaggerated stories of his exploits, winning laughs from table after table. For him, tension was a thing to distract from, something to dissolve in rum and charm. But even he wasn't blind to the shifting mood. He saw how quickly men turned quiet when his jokes brushed too close to the subject of Rogers. He saw how easily smiles slipped the moment someone mentioned the word pardon, and he felt, even more sharply than others, how the air of Nassau had changed. But the strangest reactions came from the common crewmen. Many of them, especially those who had once served in harsh naval ships, were torn between relief and fear. Pardon meant a clean slate, a return to normal life. No more living with the looming threat of the gallows. But accepting the pardon would also mean abandoning the freedom they had carved with their own hands. No more voting for captains. No more equal shares. No more choosing their fate. It felt like a betrayal of what Nassau had become. So the island split. Not openly, not formally, but in the quiet ways that truly matter. Groups formed in corners of the taverns. Some gathered around Hornigold's old supporters, speaking about the necessity of order. Others gravitated toward Vane, who made it clear that surrender was nothing but cowardice. And a third group drifted toward Blackbeard, curious about what he was planning, aware that his mind always traveled 2 steps ahead. Still, daily life continued, uneasy but recognizable. Ships still came and went. Barrels of gunpowder rolled across the sand. Women still mended torn shirts for a few coins. Gambling tables stayed crowded deep into the night. But even the sea felt different. One afternoon, a merchant sloop approached Nassau waving a ragged white sheet, asking permission to drop anchor. Usually, pirates ignored such requests. They simply took what they wanted. But this time the crew on shore watched silently, suspiciously. When the merchant captain rowed himself to shore, he carried no cargo, no crates, just news. He told them that in the larger ports, Port Royal, Kingston, Havana, the talk of Woodes Rogers dominated every tavern. He described how sailors were placing bets on how many pirates would surrender, how many would refuse, how many would die. And then he added something few in Nassau had expected. He said that Rogers wasn't traveling alone. He had assembled a small squadron, warships, not merchant vessels, trained soldiers, cannons enough to flatten Nassau's battered defenses, and more importantly, paperwork signed and stamped by the Crown, naming him governor of the Bahamas with full authority to enact martial law if needed. That detail struck harder than any mention of cannons. A governor meant change. Permanent change. Law, courts, taxes. Structures the pirates had fled from in the first place. That evening, as the sun burned orange over the water, word spread fast. Men walked with quicker steps. The taverns filled earlier than usual. And in one corner of the ruined fort, still half rubble from years of neglect, Blackbeard met with a handful of trusted crew. No lanterns, no rum, just voices carried on the wind. One of his men asked the question others whispered but didn't dare say aloud. If Rogers lands, do we fight or run? Blackbeard didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the darkening water, his silhouette still, the sea breeze lifting the loose ends of his beard. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. Neither, he said. Not until we see what he brings. The men exchanged looks. That wasn't reassurance. It wasn't a warning. It was strategy. Blackbeard was waiting. Waiting to read Rogers' intentions. Waiting to judge the strength of the fleet. Waiting to decide whether Nassau would bend or break. But not everyone shared his patience. Because far across the island, in a dim, crowded tavern, Charles Vane slammed a knife into a wooden beam and declared loudly enough for every man inside to hear. Let Rogers come. Let him walk right into our port. I'll show him what Nassau thinks of kings and governors. A roar of approval followed. But beneath it ran a thread of dread, because some men believed Vane, and some feared he would destroy everything long before the governor ever arrived. Night settled heavily over Nassau, thicker than usual, as if the clouds themselves were weighed down by the decisions no one wanted to make. Torches flickered along the shore, casting long stretched shadows across the sand where small groups of pirates still argued in low, tense voices. The sea moved quietly, rolling in and out without its usual restless chatter, as though it sensed the strain in the men who lived by it. Charles Vane's outburst in the tavern hadn't stayed contained to 4 wooden walls. It swept across the island like gunfire, fast, sharp, impossible to ignore. Within an hour, every pirate, fisherman, rumseller, and hanger-on had heard that Vane was ready to fight the governor before the man even set foot on the island. Some celebrated him for it. Others cursed him. Most simply felt torn to their bones. By the time the moon climbed high, the population of Nassau had organically split into wandering clusters. Vane's supporters leaned against railings or sat on overturned barrels, muttering about glory and defiance. They sharpened blades that were already sharp enough, paced back and forth with restless energy, and checked the flints on their pistols over and over as though preparing for battle calmed their nerves. In another corner of the settlement, Hornigold's sympathizers discussed the benefits of accepting the pardon. They emphasized the steady wages honest sailors earned, the peace that came with no longer glancing over their shoulders, and the fact that a British warship could reduce Nassau's makeshift defenses to splinters in minutes. These men weren't cowards, they'd fought their whole lives. But they knew when a fight couldn't be won. And more importantly, they understood how fragile Nassau was beneath all its bravado. And caught between these extremes was Blackbeard, unbothered by the noise on either side. That night, he walked down a quiet stretch of beach, accompanied by only 2 of his closest officers. The waves brushed against their boots as they moved. Unlike Vane's men, Blackbeard's crew didn't boast or shout. They trusted their captain's silence more than another man's speeches. One of them, Israel Hands, finally spoke. "Vane's stirring a storm he can't put down once it breaks." Blackbeard didn't stop walking. "He always does." Hands hesitated, then added, "Some of the boys are wondering where you stand. They're uneasy, Captain." The moon shimmered on the water as Blackbeard paused, glancing toward the faint shape of the horizon, the direction Rogers would come from. His voice, when it came, was low but settled. "Men who panic in the dark will panic worse in daylight," he said. "Let them talk. When Rogers arrives, feet will move faster than mouths." Hands fell silent, understanding that Blackbeard wasn't worried about Vane's noise. He was worried about timing. His own decision, the governor's ambition, the moment when one wrong act could collapse everything Nassau had built. Back in the center of town, Calico Jack drifted between factions like a man trying to avoid a sudden brawl. He laughed where laughter was needed, agreed where agreement calmed tempers, raised his hands when 2 groups looked ready to lunge at each other. But beneath his playful exterior, even Jack could feel the pressure tightening like a rope. He slipped into a darkened alley to catch his breath, running a hand across his face. The truth was simple. He had no appetite for Vane's brand of chaos. And yet, he couldn't see himself standing beside Hornigold's old circle either. The idea of giving up the freedom he'd tasted at sea felt like surrendering a piece of his soul. He wasn't alone in this internal war. Hundreds of men and women wrestled with the same impossible choice. And the days were slipping by. At the small, battered dock on the west side of Nassau, a group of ship carpenters worked late into the night, patching damaged planks, tightening railings, reinforcing masts. Not because someone had told them to, but because they knew they might soon need a fast escape. Others cleaned pistols, stacked powder, gathered provisions in secret. Even before Rogers arrived, Nassau was preparing for his presence as though he were already in the harbor. But the most surprising shift came the following morning. Near the waterline, before the sun had fully broken over the horizon, a lone figure stood watching the dawn. He wore a worn coat but carried himself with old discipline. Back straight, hands clasped behind him, gaze steady. A few early rising pirates recognized him and paused, whispering. It was Benjamin Hornigold. For months he had kept to the quieter edges of Nassau. He was respected, yes, but no longer dominant. Younger captains had eclipsed him. Vane had dismissed him as outdated. Blackbeard had outgrown him in renown. But now, right when Nassau was unraveling, Hornigold's presence carried a weight that felt suddenly relevant again. He walked toward the market square, nodding at familiar faces who hadn't expected to see him out so early. When he reached the center, he climbed onto a crate and looked over the small crowd forming naturally around him. He said nothing at first. He didn't need to. The island held its breath waiting. Finally, Hornigold spoke. "We made Nassau what it is," he said. "But we cannot pretend the world beyond these shores has vanished. Rogers is coming. And whether you love or hate the crown, the man carries the law with him. Real one. With teeth." Men shifted uneasily. Women crossed their arms but listened. Hornigold continued, his voice firm. "I won't tell any man what choice to make. But I will not be part of a war we cannot win." A ripple passed through the crowd. Not cheers. Not anger. Something softer. Something like clarity. Vane's supporters would call this cowardice. Blackbeard would call it foresight. But to the ordinary men standing in front of Hornigold, it sounded like truth. And as they absorbed it, the balance in Nassau began, quietly, to tilt. Because Hornigold had not told them to surrender. He had simply reminded them what was at stake. And in an island ruled by impulse, sometimes the quietest words carried the sharpest edge. The crowd that had gathered around Hornigold slowly dispersed, some drifting away in thoughtful silence, others breaking into small clusters to argue in hushed voices. His words didn't ignite the same loud reaction Vane's defiance had, yet they lingered in the morning air longer, sinking deeper into the minds of the men who heard them. It was the kind of speech that didn't demand loyalty. It simply reminded people of reality. And sometimes reality felt heavier than any sword. By midday, Nassau felt like a settlement living in two different futures at once. Half the men walked with the restless swagger of those preparing for a fight they believed would prove their courage. The other half moved with the uneasy quiet of people weighing consequences. And somewhere between those two currents, conversations grew sharper, tempers quicker, trust thinner. The taverns filled early. Rum sloshed into mugs long before the sun reached its highest point. The air inside each wooden room buzzed with tension and sweat, and the lingering smell of gunpowder from men who'd been cleaning their pistols at their tables. Chairs scraped. Boots hammered the floor. A few card games started but ended quickly. No one seemed patient enough to sit still. In one of the dimmer taverns, Vane slumped in a chair, legs splayed, elbows resting on his knees. His eyes were bloodshot but clear. He'd heard Hornigold had spoken that morning. And he'd heard what was said. Jack Rackham sat across from him, stirring a mug with the absent-minded slowness of someone unsure whether he belonged in the room at all. "People are listening to Hornigold," Jack murmured carefully. Vane's jaw flexed. "People have always listened to cowards when they're frightened." "That's not what I said. You didn't need to." Jack looked down at his drink. He didn't want a fight, not with Vane, not now. But the truth was spreading just as fast as the rumors. Hornigold's voice carried weight again, and Vane wasn't prepared to share any measure of influence. A shadow fell across their table, and Bonnie leaned against the edge of the wooden surface, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Rogers'll be here soon," she said. "You feel it in the air yet? Men are trying to pick sides before he's in sight." Vane snorted. "Then they're fools for rushing it." "No," Anne replied calmly, "they're scared. And scared men don't wait." Silence stretched between them for a moment. Anne's gaze softened slightly. "You push too hard, Vane, they'll crack. You know that." But Vane's pride was already bruised. Hornigold had taken the morning. Blackbeard was quietly gathering rising respect. And Vane, who lived on noise and fire, felt the island slipping from his grip. Jack exhaled quietly, rubbing his forehead. "We need to think smart. Not hard. Smart." Vane leaned back, chin lifted stubbornly. "I won't bend for some governor. I won't kneel to England. And I damn sure won't let Hornigold drag us back into servitude." And exchanged a glance with Jack, one that said more than words. Vane was spiraling. And Nassau couldn't afford him spiraling. Outside, the humidity pressed heavier as the afternoon steeped. Birds screeched overhead, circling in uneasy patterns. Even the palm leaves seemed to hang still, as if the wind was holding its breath. Down by the docks, Blackbeard stood with several of his crew, watching the horizon with the stillness of a stone statue. His men waited in silence behind him, knowing better than to break his concentration. One finally whispered, "Nothing yet, Captain." Blackbeard's voice was low. But soon, the word settled deep into the bones of the men around him, 'cause they all felt it. The world wasn't waiting for Nassau to decide its future. The world was bringing that future straight toward them. As the sun dipped toward late afternoon, signs of internal fracture became more obvious. Two pirates nearly came to blows outside a supply shed, one accusing the other of stealing powder, the other insisting he was securing it for their crew. A heated argument erupted outside the brothel over which faction the girls supported. Even the marketplace, a place usually humming with trade, felt slow and tense, vendors speaking in clipped tones, eyes darting to the sea. At the far edge of the settlement, close to the line where forest met sand, children played quietly with pine cones and driftwood. Their laughter was softer, their movements more cautious. Even they sensed Nassau was holding its breath. Inside an abandoned storeroom, a small group of carpenters and riggers met in secret, whispering plans to choose the pardon and leave with Rogers if he offered safe passage back to England. They weren't pirates. They'd never wanted to be. A few muttered prayers, crossing themselves as though speaking such hopes out loud might provoke someone, or something dangerous. And above all of this, the sea kept shifting, restless, pushing waves against the shore in uneven rhythms. At sunset, an eerie quiet washed over Nassau, the kind that didn't feel like peace, but like the moment before a gun misfires. Blackbeard returned to his crew's quarters, the fire from the oil lamps casting flickering shapes across the walls. He removed his coat slowly, as though preparing himself not for sleep, but for a weight he'd been carrying too long. Hands approached cautiously. "Captain, the men want to know what we'll do when Rogers arrives." Blackbeard didn't look at him. Instead, he tightened the tie around one of the small braids woven into his beard, the ones he would later lace with slow-burning fuses. "When he arrives," he said quietly, "we'll do what keeps Nassau alive." Hands hesitated. "And if Vane refuses?" Blackbeard finally lifted his eyes. "Then Charles will have to learn," he said calmly, "that a man doesn't fight a hurricane by shouting at the wind." Outside, lanterns flickered. Voices murmured in the deepening twilight. A final sliver of sun dipped below the horizon. And far, far out on the water, something moved with the deliberate steadiness of a vessel carrying law, order and consequence. A shape that would reach Nassau soon. Very soon. Night draped itself over Nassau without ceremony, swallowing the last trace of sun in a single quiet breath. Lanterns flickered to life one by one, tiny clusters of gold trembling against the dark like frail promises, that everything was normal, that this was just another evening on the island. But Nassau knew better. The air felt heavier, as though the sea itself leaned closer to listen. On the docks, men stood in long, uneven lines, staring out into the black horizon where the faint silhouette had appeared minutes earlier. Small, distant, but undeniable. A ship moving steadily toward them. Not aimlessly, not drifting, coming. Nobody spoke for a long time. The waves clapped against the pilings in slow, uneven rhythms, matching the tight, nervous heartbeats of every man watching. A whisper finally broke the silence. "Is that him?" Another voice, brittle. "Looks like a sloop. Royal paint." Someone spat on the ground. "Then it's Rogers." The name spread through the crowd like smoke. At the edge of the pier, Hornigold stepped forward, his posture straighter than usual. He studied the distant lights with a calmness that wasn't confidence. Just a man who'd accepted what the future held long before the rest of Nassau had. Behind him, a cluster of pirates muttered anxiously, waiting for a cue, a sign, something. Blackbeard appeared next, emerging from the shadows with slow, powerful steps. His eyes locked on the horizon, unreadable. Men instinctively stepped aside for him, creating a wide path. His silence felt heavier than any speech Vane could ever shout. Then Vane arrived, storm in his steps, fury in his shoulders, and followed at a distance, not stopping him, just shadowing him like someone trailing a lit fuse. Vane scanned the crowd, jaw clenched. "You're all staring at a speck of nothing," he growled. "That ain't fate. That ain't judgment. That's one man. One. And we're 20 times his number." His voice bounced across the wooden planks, trying to ignite something. A few men nodded, restless. Most didn't move. Vane's eyes narrowed. The crowd's silence was an answer he didn't like. "Rogers puts his boot on your neck," he snarled. "And some of you will thank him for it." The words stung, but they didn't ignite. Not this time, Rackham murmured to and beneath his breath. They're split. Badly. And nodded, eyes on Vane. He's trying to scare them into loyalty. But fear's already got its claws in them from the sea. As if summoned by her words, a low roll of thunder murmured across the distant sky. Not from clouds, but from the slow, steady boom of a ship's cannons firing a signal into the air. A formal announcement. A governor approaches. Prepare yourselves. The sound washed over the docks like a wave of cold brine. Some men flinched. Others straightened. Few crossed themselves. Hornigold inhaled deeply. He's sending a message. Wants his arrival to be law, not a negotiation. Vane spat on the planks. He wants fear. Blackbeard's voice rumbled softly behind them. Then he'll get it. The quiet weight of those words turned the heads of half the dock. Vane spun toward him. You agree with him, then? With Rogers? Blackbeard stepped closer. Slow, deliberate, implacable as a tide. His size alone sent a ripple through the crowd. But his expression didn't shift. I agree, he said calmly, that you're barkin' louder than you're bit in. You want a war. But you ain't got a plan for after the first shot. Vane stiffened. For a heartbeat, the world shrank around the two of them. We don't bend, Vane growled. We don't kneel. We fight. Blackbeard's voice was almost gentle. And what then? England sends 10 more ships. A fleet. A hangman. What's your answer to that storm, Charles? Vane opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence that followed pressed like a hand around Nassau's throat, and stepped forward, breaking the tension with a low murmur. Look, before any of us die over pride, maybe we wait and see what Rogers actually demands. Vane shot her a look sharp enough to cut rope. You think he's comin' for a chat? She shrugged, cool as moonlight. Maybe. Or maybe he's comin' to negotiate. Or maybe he's comin' to put us on ropes. But guessin' won't change his course. Rackham sighed. She's right, Vane. We might as well see the man before we throw the island into flames. Vane's fists tightened. Above them, the sky deepened into a thick velvet blue. Stars blinked to life. The ship on the horizon grew closer, its lanterns clearer now, swinging with the steady rhythm of authority, discipline, structure. Everything Nassau was not. The men on the docks watched as the sloop cut toward the harbor, its bow slicing the dark water cleanly. The creak of its hull drifted across the bay, followed by the thud of heavy boots and the low murmur of English sailors preparing to dock. Every pirate on the pier stood absolutely still, every breath caught, every heart tightened, and as the sloop glided closer, its flag became unmistakable under the lantern glow. St. George's Cross, red and white, England, official, inevitable. Nassau no longer wondered what future was coming. It was arriving. Night folded tighter around the harbor, pressing its weight against the water as the English sloop eased into the mouth of the bay. Its lantern swung in neat, disciplined arcs. Nothing chaotic, nothing drunken, nothing like Nassau. The pirates watched in a silence so taut it felt like a rope ready to snap. Lines were tossed. Hooks clanged. English voices called out in crisp, clipped commands that echoed with a confidence the island hadn't heard in years. The hull groaned as it nestled against the pier, and for a moment the only sound was the soft slap of waves against wood. Then came the footsteps, measured, heavy, and hurried. A figure appeared at the gangplank, silhouetted against the lamplight, broad-shouldered, straight-backed, carrying the kind of stillness that wasn't peace but control. Woods Rogers descended, one step at a time, as though the dock itself were bowing to him. Men on the pier shifted, but nobody moved forward. Not even Hornigold. Rogers paused at the bottom of the gangplank, surveying them. This motley assembly of sunburned faces, ragged shirts, patched boots, and wary eyes. His gaze slid across them like a blade testing weight, measuring threat, judging usefulness. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried like a bell. Good evening, gentlemen. Not a greeting. Declaration. Blackbeard's stance tightened almost imperceptibly. Vane's jaw clenched hard enough to crack teeth. Anne's hand drifted subtly toward the hilt at her belt. Rackham swallowed like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Rogers continued, unmoved. "My men will unload the documents shortly," he said. "And at dawn I expect every captain, crewman and claimant of this island to gather in the square." A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Documents, not shackles. Not soldiers marching out to seize the dock. Vane stepped forward, suspicion sharpening every line of him. "What documents?" Rogers met his glare without flinching. "The king's pardon," he said simply. The word struck like a stone dropped into still water, soft in sound, devastating in consequence. Several pirates blinked. Others exchanged startled glances. Hornigold exhaled slowly, as if some truth he'd carried privately was finally surfacing. Vane barked a bitter laugh, the sound jagged and humorless. "And we're meant to believe that. You sail into Nassau, wave a piece of paper, and think we'll kneel like good little dogs." Rogers tilted his head slightly. "No," he said calmly. "I expect you to consider survival. Kneeling is optional." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Fear tangled with curiosity, anger fused with temptation. Blackbeard's voice slid through the silence like a low tide. "And what of those who choose otherwise?" Rogers didn't hesitate. "Those who refuse will be treated as enemies of the crown, and hunted accordingly." The wind picked up then, just enough to make the English flag snap overhead like a judgment rendered. Vane took one hard step forward, chest rising. "You'll hunt us," he growled. "Here." Rogers didn't blink. "Everywhere." For a long breath, nobody moved. Even the sea seemed to hold back its next wave. Then, unexpectedly, Rogers softened just a fraction. His posture still rigid but his tone almost weary. "You've built something here," he said, eyes passing over the crooked taverns, the makeshift stalls, the tangle of ropes and sails and half-patched slums. Chaotic, lawless, fragile, but remarkable in its own way. His gaze returned to Blackbeard, to Vane, to every weather-beaten face staring back at him. "And now," he said quietly, "you must decide what becomes of it." A gull cried overhead, cutting through the stillness like an omen. Rogers turned toward his men. "Secure the pier. I want armed watch through the night." The English sailors moved instantly, like extensions of his will. As Rogers started toward the long road leading into Nassau, he paused just once, looking back at the crowd of hardened men now forced to imagine a world with no hiding place. No more sanctuary. No more immunity disguised as chaos. Blackbeard exhaled slowly, gaze fixed ahead. Vane's fists trembled, and watched Rogers disappear into the dark streets with the same expression she'd give a storm gathering offshore. Calculating, measuring, listening to the wind. Rackham whispered, "God help us." But the night, heavy and listening, offered no reply. Just the low groan of the English sloop settling into its place at Nassau's heart, like a nail hammered halfway in, waiting for the next blow. The night pressed inward as Rogers' footsteps faded into the narrow streets, swallowed one by the dark. For a few long moments the dock stayed frozen, pirates standing as still as the barnacled pilings beneath them, unsure whether to exhale, shout, or run. Then the murmurs began, soft at first, nervous, fractured. "He brought soldiers, real ones, trained ones. A pardon. For us. There's got to be a trick. Enemies of the crown, hunted. God preserve us." The whispers tangled like frayed rope, tightening. Vane spun on the nearest cluster of men, voice sharp and cold. "You hear him. You hear what he said. Hunted. Not pardoned. Hunted. That paper is no gift. It's a leash." But the fire he'd stoked so easily before didn't catch this time. The men were afraid, but not of surrender. Not of shame. They were afraid of the alternative. Blackbeard stepped forward just enough that the crowd shifted again, retreating from his shadow as naturally as a tide pulling back from rocks. His voice low and steady. "Go home. All of you. Get quiet. Don't drink. Don't fight. Don't plan anything stupid in the dark." A few men nodded instantly, because Blackbeard rarely gave advice. When he did, it was survival-shaped. But Vane snapped toward him, disbelief twisting his features. "You're just letting him walk in. Letting him take what we built." Blackbeard's gaze didn't change. "We'll talk at dawn," he said. "When the king's words are on the table and not echoes on the wind." Vane's lip curled. "That's not leadership. That's fear." Blackbeard stepped closer, and for the briefest second the crowd held its breath, watching two storms drift into the same sky. His voice was quiet, but it hit with the weight of cannon shot. "This isn't fear. This is patience. Oz. And you'd do well to learn the difference." Vane's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Not because he agreed, but because challenging Blackbeard in front of this many eyes would be suicide dressed as pride. And Rackham exchanged a glance, one of those small, silent communications built from months of shared trouble, and tilted her head toward Vane, almost gentle. "Charles, come on. Not here." He didn't look at her, but after a long moment his shoulders softened by a fraction. A fraction was enough. He turned away. The crowd slowly broke apart, drifting like scattered embers blown by a wind that refused to settle. Some walked off muttering. Others stared toward the dark streets where Rogers had vanished, as if expecting soldiers to appear at any second. Hornigold lingered last, watching the English sloop with an expression no one could quite read, something between regret and relief. He finally approached Blackbeard, voice low. "You know what this means." Blackbeard didn't respond. Hornigold tried again, softer. "He'll offer it. Pardon. The king's mercy. No more running. No more hanging over our heads." Blackbeard's gaze stayed fixed on the glowing windows of the town, where new shadows moved with military precision. "And you think men like us deserve mercy?" Hornigold swallowed. "Deserving's got nothing to do with surviving." The wind shifted then, cold, salty, pushing inland. A storm brewing someplace far out at sea, maybe. Or maybe something else. Blackbeard turned away first, boots thudding soft and deliberate on the planks. "I'll see you at dawn." Hornigold watched him go, expression heavy. Rackham and followed Vane into the maze of Nassau's back alleys. Their voices faded quickly. Soon the dock stood empty except for the English watchman and the rasp of waves beneath the pier. Above them, the flag of St. George fluttered in the night breeze, its red cross catching the lantern light like a quiet, patient promise. Change has already arrived. You can accept it or be crushed by it. And somewhere deep in Nassau, as pirates slipped into their homes with restless minds and pounding hearts, the island itself felt different. Still wild, still free, but no longer untouched. Morning rose slow and uneasy over Nassau, as if even the sun hesitated to touch the island now claimed, quietly, confidently, under England's returning shadow. A thin pale light slid across the harbor, catching on the polished uniforms of Roger's soldiers who had already begun arranging themselves in small, organized knots along the main paths. Order spreading through chaos like ink in water. The pirates waking in scattered houses and shacks felt it at once. The rhythm of the island had shifted. The streets didn't sound the same. Heavy boots replaced bare feet. Commands replaced shouting. English accents replaced drunken arguments. By the time Blackbeard stepped outside, the town was already half awake with nervous murmuring. He walked slowly, the way a man approaches a battlefield he hasn't yet chosen to die on. The others were waiting by the old well, the square where arguments, threats, celebrations, and plans had been traded for years. But today it felt like hostile ground. Noisy, watched, stripped of its familiar rough comfort. Hornigold stood tall, hands behind his back, eyes clear, and leaned against a post, arms crossed, scanning every soldier that passed. Rackham shifted from foot to foot, clearly wishing he looked less like someone who'd once stolen a ship just to impress a woman. Vane paced in a tight line, jaw clenched, muttering curses under his breath. The moment Blackbeard approached, Vane stopped and glared at him. "You still think hearing him out is a good idea?" Blackbeard didn't answer immediately. He looked at the sun just beginning to burn through the morning haze. Then at the English soldiers. Then at the pirates watching from windows and door cracks. Then finally at Vane. "I think," he said quietly, "that dying without listening makes a man a fool." Vane scoffed. "And bending makes him a coward." Anne's voice slipped in like a knife wrapped in silk. "Better a living coward than a dead fool." Vane shot her a sharp look, but she didn't flinch. Before he could respond, footsteps approached. Measured, steady, unmistakably official. Rogers came into view flanked by 2 uniformed officers. His clothes were immaculate despite the journey. His hat crisp. His expression calm and firm. He carried no weapon openly, and yet everything about him radiated authority as tangible as any steel. The pirates stiffened. Rogers stopped a few paces from them, letting silence settle with heavy precision. "Good morning," he said, voice smooth, clipped and practiced. "I trust you slept," Vane muttered. "Like angels," under his breath, but Hornigold stepped forward and cut off any further outburst with a quick glance. Rogers continued as if no interruption existed. "I'll speak plainly. His Majesty King George extends a full pardon to all who have taken up piracy, provided you renounce it immediately, surrender your arms, and swear loyalty to the crown." He let the words hang. Solid. Inescapable. A few pirates in earshot murmured in disbelief. Rogers watched the reactions with sharp, calculating eyes. "This is not a trick," he said. "Nor a trap. You have been given a chance. One you will not receive again." Vane stepped forward, voice tight and dangerous. "And if we refuse?" Rogers didn't blink. "Then the law regards you as outlaws, and I will hunt you, without pause, without forgiveness, until the last of you is broken." His officers shifted slightly behind him, subtle but unmistakably ready. Blackbeard's face didn't move, but his eyes sharpened the way steel does before striking flint. Rogers' gaze settled on Hornigold. "You understand the gravity of what I'm offering. You, especially." Hornigold nodded slowly. "I do." He looked back at the others. At Vane, trembling with barely contained fury. At Rackham, who couldn't decide if this was salvation or doom. At Anne, whose eyes remained calculating. At Blackbeard, silent, inscrutable, the axis upon which the whole moment seemed to balance. Hornigold inhaled, and in that breath, Nassau felt something shift. But irreversible. "I accept the king's pardon," he said, loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear. The words were too heavy, too final to feel real. Vane's face twisted, betrayal and rage colliding like sparks on dry powder. "You!" His voice cracked. "You're talking his hand." Hornigold didn't look away. "I'm talking life over a noose." Vane stepped forward, fists clenched. "You coward!" Blackbeard's voice cut through the air before violence could bloom. "What happens," he said to Rogers, "to those who accept?" Rogers turned to him calmly. "They will be protected, allowed to settle, allowed to work, clothed, fed, and free under the crown's law." Blackbeard studied him, searching for lies, weaknesses, anything beneath the polished exterior. After a long, heavy moment, he spoke again. "And those who refuse?" Rogers didn't hesitate. "They will meet the noose, the sword, or the sea." Something unreadable flickered across Blackbeard's features. Not fear. Not agreement. Something deeper. And exhaled slowly, barely audible. Rackham rubbed the back of his neck. Hornigold stood steady. Vane shook like a storm barely held together. But every eye was on Blackbeard now. Because whatever he chose, the island would follow. Blackbeard didn't answer immediately. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady, as if he were listening to something deeper than the words spoken, something beneath the earth itself. Rogers watched him with the patience of a man who knew the power of silence. The soldiers behind the governor adjusted their grips on their muskets, though none dared raise them. Even they understood this moment held a different kind of danger. The pirates standing around the square leaned forward without meaning to, pulled toward the weight of what Blackbeard might decide. For years Nassau had revolved around him, not in a way he forced, but in the way storms command attention. Massive, unpredictable, undeniable. Blackbeard finally lifted his gaze toward Rogers. "And what of the ones who sign your pardon?" he said quietly. "Then find their lives worth less under your rule than they were at sea." Rogers didn't flinch. "Then they may leave," he answered. "So long as they do not take up piracy again." A few nearby pirates exchanged glances, hopeful for the first time in days. But Blackbeard wasn't done. "And what of the ones who carry history with them? Who've shed blood because the world left them no choice? Will the crown overlook old mistakes?" Rogers' eyes sharpened, though his voice stayed smooth. "The crown overlooks all past crimes except murder committed in cold blood. The pardon is generous, but not blind." The square grew tense. Vane let out a bitter laugh. "Generous," he spat. "You hear that? We're supposed to thank him." Rogers didn't turn toward Vane. "You're meant to understand the gravity of your situation." Blackbeard's jaw tightened just slightly. Not anger, not fear. Reflection. And watched him with quiet certainty. She could feel the island holding its breath. Rackham whispered to her, "What's he thinkin'?" Anne's eyes didn't leave Blackbeard. "The same thing we all are. Whether livin' under a governor is worth losin' what we built." A bird cried somewhere overhead, sharp and lonely. Felt like the only sound in the world. Finally Blackbeard breathed out. Slow, heavy, grounding. "I won't take the pardon today." Gasps rippled outward, sharp as splintered wood. Roger's expression barely changed. "You intend to remain an outlaw?" Blackbeard shook his head once. "I intend to think." "To what?" "To decide with a clear mind rather than panic." He stepped closer, not threatening, but large enough that the soldiers behind Rogers instinctively stiffened. "I ain't your enemy yet," Blackbeard said, voice low as a rolling tide. "But I ain't your subject either." Rogers studied him, weighing the words the way a man might weigh powder and shot. "You will have until the end of the season," he said. "After that, any who have not accepted will be treated as enemies of the crown." Vane barked a laugh. "Enemies? We already were. Only difference is now you've come to say it to our faces." Rackham winced. "Vane." But it was too late. Roger's gaze had shifted onto Vane completely now. Calm, cold, appraising the way a surgeon studies a wound he intends to cut open. "You," Roger said, "will not receive the same patience. Your name is written in too many accounts. Ships burned under your orders. Prisoners tortured. Crews slaughtered." Vane's breath caught in his chest, fury and something colder flaring behind his eyes. "So it's decided then," he said. "I'm a dead man in your book." Rogers didn't hesitate. "You already buried yourself, Mr. Vane. I'm merely here to mark the grave." The square went utterly still, and took a single step forward, instinct ready to intercept whatever explosion Vane was building inside him. But Vane didn't lash out. Not physically. His anger condensed into something sharper, darker, quieter. "You're making a mistake," he said. Rogers gave the faintest tilt of his head. "The mistake was yours long before I arrived." Hornigold stepped between them, not siding with either, just preventing a spark from hitting powder. "That's enough," he said firmly. Rogers straightened. "I'll expect all who wish to accept the pardon to present themselves by dusk. My officers will take names." He turned to leave. Pause. Without looking back, he added, "And Nassau will have order, one way or another." Then he walked away, soldiers falling in behind him. Their boots thudded against the packed dirt, rhythmic, unhurried, certain. When they were gone, the square seemed to exhale, as though the island itself had been holding tension in its ribs. Vane rounded on Hornigold instantly. "You traitor." Hornigold didn't look ashamed. "I'm not dyin' for a dream that already ended." Vane's voice dropped to a hiss. "It ends when we stop fightin'. Not before." Blackbeard stepped forward before the argument could spiral. "Enough." His voice wasn't loud, but it was final. "We ain't decidin' every man's fate in one morning." His gaze swept the remaining pirates. "But Rogers is right about one thing. The days ahead will be hard. And we don't have the luxury of tannin' on each other." Vane's breathing slowed, though anger still pulsed through him like a second heartbeat, and spoke softly, but her words landed like stones. "We'll need to choose our sides soon." Blackbeard nodded once. "But not today." Silence grew around them. Dense, uncertain, heavy with futures that hadn't taken shape yet. Then, from somewhere deeper in town, the sound of a hammer striking wood echoed. Soldiers building scaffolds, platforms, barricades, a new order rising board by board. Rackham swallowed. "This place is changin' fast," and replied, "And not in our favor." Blackbeard didn't turn toward the noise. He just stared toward the tree-line, where the island's deeper secrets still lingered like a shadow waiting for nightfall. "Change comes to every kingdom," he murmured. "But not all kingdoms bow." Blackbeard's words drifted out into the warm Nassau air, slow and heavy, like smoke curling from a lantern wick. The pirates around him didn't answer right away. They felt the shift, felt the island's spine bending under the new weight placed upon it, and was the first to move. She walked toward the edge of the square, boots quiet against the dirt, eyes tracing the soldiers' construction in the distance. Her voice dipped low. "They're buildin' more than fences," she said. "They're buildin' a message." Rackham rubbed at the back of his neck, nerves twitching. "A message sayin' what?" "That we're welcome, so long as we stay tame." Blackbeard didn't look at either of them. His gaze stayed on the tree-line. Dark, dense, a place where the air still belonged to men like him. "No," he said softly. "A message sayin' they ain't leavin'." A warm breeze pushed through the square then, brushing against shirts, rattling beads in hair, tugging at old scars and older memories. It carried a faint scent of salt and wood tar, ship smells, freedom smells. Smells that didn't mix with soldiers and new laws. Vane stepped closer to Blackbeard, voice raw but controlled. "So what now? We just wait. Let them build their gallows and their rules, and hope they forget to come for us." Blackbeard finally turned to him. Slow, deliberate. "No," he said. "We learn 'em first. We watch how they move. We see who they bring. And only then do we decide what to break." Anne's lips twitched, something like grim approval turning the edge of her expression. "That means keepin' our men calm," she said. "Some of them are ready to bolt. Others are ready to riot." Rackham huffed a humorless laugh. "And I'm ready for a drink." Blackbeard's mouth curved faintly. Not a smile, just the hint of someone remembering a softer piece of the world. "You'll have one," he murmured. "But not yet." He looked back at the square, at the marks left by soldiers' boot prints, at the dust still settling over Nassau like a thin veil. "Tonight," he said, "we meet at the old lighthouse. No exceptions." And angled her head. "Even Vane." Blackbeard's gaze flicked to him, steady, firm, unflinching. "Especially Vane." For a moment something silent passed between them, something sharp, something old, something that had teeth but also memory. Vane gave a curt nod. "Fine." The group began to disperse, pirates peeling off toward alleys, taverns, hidden corners where whispers traveled faster than ships. Nassau felt different under their feet, like sand shifting before a storm, and fell into step beside Blackbeard as they walked. "You trust Rogers to keep his word, till season's end?" she asked quietly. Blackbeard exhaled through his nose, the sound soft, weighted. "I trust him to do what benefits him. And right now, patience benefits him. But not us." "No," Blackbeard murmured. "Not us." A gull screamed overhead, harsh and distant. The docks creaked with the slow roll of tide. Somewhere, coins clinked in a counting house. New rules already settling into the bones of the island. Rackham jogged up behind them, slightly breathless. "What about the men who already signed the pardon?" he asked. "They'll be watched. Maybe used against us." "They made their choice," Anne said. "But choices have consequences," Blackbeard finished. They reached the edge of the market street. The sun had dipped just a little lower, casting the town in slanted gold. Dust hung suspended in the glow like tiny drifting stars. Blackbeard stopped walking. He let the air settle around him, warm and thick, humming with the sound of a world about to tilt. "Tonight," he repeated quietly, "we decide our own consequences." And then, with a slow blink, as if waking from a dream he never meant to have, he turned toward the shore, toward the place where the ocean waited like an old companion, deep and unforgiving and free. The ocean didn't roar that afternoon. Breathe. A long, rolling hush that drifted across the sand and wrapped itself around Blackbeard as he approached the shoreline. Each step sank into the warm grit, grains shifting in quiet surrender beneath his boots. The tide slid in and out, gentle, deliberate, like a creature thinking. Anne and Rackham followed a few paces behind, their shadows stretching thin in the late sun. Rackham squinted toward the water. "Feels strange," he murmured. "Like it knows something we don't." Anne replied without looking away from Blackbeard. "It always knows more than we do." Blackbeard stopped right at the water's reach, where the foam curled around the tips of his boots. He inhaled deeply, letting the ocean salt tighten his chest in that familiar grounding way, the way only old sailors understood. Like the sea itself was reminding him who he'd been long before kings and governors tried shaping him into anything else. His voice dropped low, almost to himself. The sea never bowed to the crown. A wave rolled in, touching his foot, then retreated as though agreeing. Rackham rubbed his arms. "That lighthouse meeting tonight. You think the men will come?" "They'll come," Anne said softly. "Fear has a way of gathering people." Blackbeard didn't turn, but his jaw shifted, the slightest motion. "It ain't fear that'll bring 'em," he said. "It's the understanding that if they don't choose something soon, Rogers will choose for them." And stepped up beside him. "And which way are you leaning?" He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Dark, steady, unreadable as deep water. "I ain't leaning," he said. "I'm watching that." She studied him for a long moment. "You always were better at patience than the rest of us." Rackham snorted. "Speak for yourself. I'm already sick o' being patient." Blackbeard finally turned from the waves. "Then use that impatience wisely," he said. "Tonight you listen. You watch. You keep quiet unless I say otherwise." Rackham's eyebrows shot up. "Quiet? Me?" And smirked. "A miracle in the making." Blackbeard walked past them, back toward the town. His boots left deep prints in the damp sand, each one filling slowly with seawater, the island erasing him step by step as he moved away. But the ocean kept watching. As they climbed the dune path back toward the settlement, faint sounds drifted from Nassau proper. Hammering, shouting, the movement of crates, the clatter of newly arrived soldiers settling into barracks. The scent of fresh-cut timber carried on the wind. The new order was growing bones. And glanced toward the horizon where a small silhouette, a ship, was sailing toward Nassau, slow and purposeful. "You see that?" she whispered. Rackham frowned. "Ain't one of ours." "No," Anne murmured. "Rogers' reinforcements." Blackbeard stopped at the crest of the hill, watching the ship too. The sails glowed a muted orange in the sinking sun, and even from this distance, the vessel carried an air of authority. Clean lines, disciplined rigging, polished hull. Not a pirate ship. "The window's closing faster than we thought," Anne said. Blackbeard didn't speak, didn't move. The wind tugged at the ends of his coat, at the braids in his beard, at the small embers of resolve sparking behind his eyes. Finally, in a tone soft but anchored, "Tonight, everything begins." and the three of them continued toward Nassau, shadows stretching long ahead of them like paths they hadn't yet chosen. The sky dimmed as they reached the edge of Nassau, the last streaks of sun melting into a violet haze. Torches flickered along the main path, their flames wavering in the evening breeze like they, too, were unsure which direction the island was shifting toward. Voices murmured behind shuttered windows. Boots scuffed along wooden porches. And somewhere deeper in town, a soldier's whistle cut through the air. Sharp, disciplined, foreign. The kind of sound Nassau had never known. Blackbeard felt it like a stone under his ribs. And Rackham followed close as they slipped into the narrower lanes, weaving past barrels, overturned crates, drying nets, and the shadows of men watching from doorways with tight jaws and restless hands. Fear was here. Not loud, but present like a cold draft just beneath the boards. Near the old well, a cluster of pirates stood whispering. Men who once filled taverns with raucous laughter now speaking like they were afraid the night itself might overhear. One of them noticed Blackbeard and stiffened. "Captain," he murmured, clearing his throat. "Word is Vane's Callan his own meetin'," and exchanged a look with Rackham. "When?" Blackbeard asked. "Already started. Out by the burned-down storeroom. He's sayin' Rogers won't stop at us talkin' the pardon. Says the governor'll hang anyone who ever flew a black flag." Blackbeard's expression barely shifted, but the air around him did, subtle, charged. "Tell the men to come to the lighthouse hill," he said quietly. "If they trust Vane's rage more than their own survival, then that's a choice." The man nodded shakily. "Yes, Captain." As he ran off, Rackham let out a long exhale. "Great. 2 meetings. What could go wrong?" And smacked him lightly on the arm. "Plenty. So hush." They continued toward the lighthouse, the path narrowing as they left the town's lantern glow behind. The slope toward the coast was darker, more exposed, the wind stronger here. The lighthouse itself stood like a silent sentinel above them, its lantern chamber dim to night. Unused, unlit, a place reclaimed by shadows. A few pirates lingered near the base already. Men Blackbeard trusted, men who trusted him. They nodded silently as he approached. "More comin'," one said. "Tensions thick enough to choke on." Blackbeard stepped onto the flat ground beneath the lighthouse, his silhouette stretching long behind him. "Let it settle," he murmured. "Better men think clearly than quickly." Minutes passed. Then more figures appeared along the path. First 3, then 7, then dozens. The murmuring grew, steady and uneasy, like wind through dry palms. And scanned the faces. "Not seein' Vane's lot. Would you expect to?" Rackham whispered. Blackbeard lifted a hand, and the crowd fell gradually silent. He stood in the half-moon's glow, the wind tugging at his coat, his hair shifting like dark ropes. "We all know why we're here," he began, voice low and even, steady as tidewater. "Rogers has soldiers buildin' walls around us. He has ships comin'. He has orders from a king who don't know our lives, our losses, or our reasons." A few pirates muttered dark agreements. "But Vane," Blackbeard continued, "he'd have you believe the only path left is fire." More murmurs, this time sharper. And watched the crowd closely, reading every twitch, every uncertain breath. Blackbeard stepped forward. "I won't stand behind a man whose anger blinds him. And I won't stand behind a governor whose order crushes us. What I will stand behind is choice." The word landed heavy, like an anchor dropped into still water. "You want the pardon. Take it. You want to leave Nassau. Do it while you still can. You want to fight. Then understand the truth." He swept his gaze across them. "Fightin' Rogers now means war. Real war. Not raids. Not taking a merchant ship. It means fasten trained men, cannons, blockades. And war ends only one of 2 ways. With surrender, or with graves." Silence spread through the crowd like a cold tide. Then a voice from the back. "What about you, Teach? What'll you choose?" Blackbeard hesitated. Not because he didn't know, but because the truth carried weight. Finally, I'll decide before the moon turns full. When I do, those who follow me will know exactly what they're walking into." The men absorbed this, their breaths slow, uncertain, heavy, and stepped forward beside him, not replacing his authority, but grounding it. "And remember," she said softly, "Vane's path might feel fierce, but it leads one way. The governor's path might feel safe, but it chains your hands. Blackbeard's path gives you the chance to think," Rackham added quietly. "And maybe to live." Another pirate called out, "What if Vane attacks first?" Blackbeard's stare turned toward town, toward the faint glow rising over the rooftops where Vane's crowd gathered like a storm's brewing heart. "Then," he said, voice low as thunder before rain, "we meet that storm head-on." The crowd shifted uneasily, some relieved, some more afraid than before, but all listening. The night tightened around them, and somewhere in the far distance, a gunshot cracked through the dark. Sudden, too close to be random. Anne's hand went instantly to her pistol. Rackham whispered, "That come from Vane's meetin'." Another shot followed, then shouting. Blackbeard's eyes narrowed. "Time's up." He stepped forward into the darkness, the pirates rushing behind him as the echoes rolled across the island like the first tremors of something Nassau had been trying to avoid. Something coming fast. Something inevitable. The shouts rose clearer as they neared the edge of town. Raw, panicked, chaotic. Torchlight flickered in nervous patterns against shuttered homes, and the smell of powder drifted on the wind like a warning carried too late. Blackbeard slowed only enough to read the air, and moved beside him, blade already in hand. Rackham stayed close behind, breath tight, eyes darting. They turned the corner, and found Vane's gathering in ruins. A dozen men scattered across the ground, some wounded, some dazed, some still scrambling to their feet. Barrels were overturned, torches trampled, and the old burnt storeroom wall bore a fresh bullet scar, splintered clean through the charred wood. Vane stood at the center, chest heaving, pistol raised, face twisted with a fury so deep it looked carved into him. Opposite him, a small contingent of Roger's soldiers held their lines, muskets aimed but not fired, their commander barking orders to hold position. Blackbeard stepped forward before another shot could spark. "What happened?" The commander answered first. "Your friend here tried to kill one of my men." Vane snapped back immediately, voice sharp with rage. "He followed us. Byron. I warned him." "You fired at him," the commander corrected coldly. "He had his hand on a blade." "He had his hand on a notebook," the commander growled. "A ledger of names. Men who attended this gathering." Anne's eyes widened. "A registry," she whispered. "Rogers wants lists." Rackham muttered. "Saints help us." Vane spat on the ground. "Let him take notes. Let him run back to his master. None of us here are signin' anyway." Some men behind him hesitated at those words. Small shifts, nervous glances. Blackbeard noticed. Vane noticed too. And it enraged him further. "You cowards," he barked at them. "You listened to him." He pointed at Blackbeard, hand trembling with fury. "You think he's gonna save you. He's stallin'. He's waitin'. He's scared to choose." The crowd stiffened. A horrible quiet bloomed. Blackbeard stepped fully into the dying torchlight. "I choose when the moment's right," he said, calm but undeniable. "Not when anger tells me to." "That's so," Vane sneered. "Then say it now. Are you with him?" He jabbed a finger toward the soldiers. "Or with us?" A murmur rippled through the gathering. The question everyone had been avoiding now hung in the air like smoke. Blackbeard didn't answer instantly. He looked at the wounded men on the ground, the terrified ones hiding in the alley behind the torches, the soldiers trembling with discipline, the island around them, quivering under the weight of a future that refused to wait any longer. Finally, "I'm with Nassau," he said. "Not with a tyrant, not with a madman, with the place that kept us alive when the world shut its doors." Vane's expression cracked. rage giving way to something far more fragile underneath. "You think Nassau wants you," he whispered. "You think it chooses you over me?" "It's not about want," Blackbeard replied. "It's about survival." Vane lifted his pistol, slow, deliberate, shaking. "Wrong answer," and stepped between them instantly, blade drawn, stance low. "Put it down, Charles." "Move," Vane hissed. "Not a chance." Rackham raised his hands, voice wavering. Let's not make this the moment we regret most." The soldiers tightened their aim. The pirates behind Vane tensed. The air grew razor-thin. Blackbeard didn't move. "If you're set on war," he said quietly, "you'll fire. And that shot'll be the spark that burns this island to bones." Vane's jaw clenched so hard it trembled. Heartbeat. Another. Then a crack. But not from Vane's weapon. A soldier's musket fired into the air. A warning. "Stand down!" the commander shouted. "All of you!" The shock broke something inside Vane. His arm faltered. His breath collapsed into shallow, ragged gasps. He lowered the pistol, but only by an inch. Just enough for Blackbeard to step forward. He reached out, slow, steady, grounded. "Charles, it's over." Vane stared at him, eyes wild with something that wasn't anger anymore, but the dread of a man watching the world he built collapse plank by plank. "I'm not bowing to him," he whispered. "I'd rather die." Blackbeard nodded once. "Then leave." The words hit Vane harder than any blow. "Take your crew," Blackbeard said. "Take the ones who want war. Oh, fight your own battle. But don't drag Nassau into your grave." Silence. Then a broken, breathless laugh escaped Vane's throat. "So that's it," he murmured. "You're pushin' me out." "No," Blackbeard said gently. "I'm lettin' you live." The torchlight caught Vane's expression, half fury, half grief. He backed away one step, then another. His loyal men gathered around him. Few, far fewer than he expected. The rest stayed where they were, staring at the ground. Vane finally turned, pushing through the shadows toward the far edge of town. He didn't look back. Not once. The soldiers lowered their weapons and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Rackham whispered, "That could have gone worse." Blackbeard didn't answer. His gaze followed the direction Vane had gone, into the trees, toward the shoreline, toward exile or rebellion or doom. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of the sea. Nassau's pulse, wild, wounded, uncertain, beat softly beneath their feet, and stepped beside him. "So what now?" Blackbeard's voice was barely above a whisper. "Now, the island learns to breathe again." He looked toward town, where torches glowed like fragile stars in the dark. "And tomorrow we start rebuildin'." Long pause. "Before Rogers does it for us." The waves crashed somewhere beyond the buildings. Slow, steady, ancient. Nassau didn't cheer. It didn't mourn. It simply stood on the edge of itself, quiet and bruised, waiting for dawn. And for the first time in a long while, Blackbeard let himself hope that it might survive. What came next?